Chapter 597. It was almost late at night when they arrived at the Mar Highlands. The silver moon hung high in the sky, casting a veil of moonlight over the mountains. The forest was silent, covering the mountains on both sides, but at the intersection of the foothills, the place where the river flowed opened up, forming a wilderness. The students of the Royal Knight Academy planned to scout the terrain during the night, but they were stopped by Brando. Brando told everyone to rest on the spot, and set up the defense in the early hours of the morning. The nobles' private soldiers were fine. After a night of walking, they were already exhausted. They praised Brando's orders, but the young students could not help but have some complaints. How could they set up the defense without scouting the terrain? Even the simplest defense line had to be adapted to the local conditions. It was written clearly in the infantry manual. What was the commander thinking? But military orders were like mountains, and everyone was destined to sleep with doubts. It was the season when the snow had just started to melt, and the forest at night was especially cold. Due to the lack of preparation, the cadets usually only had a thin blanket on their bodies. One could imagine how cold it would be in this kind of temperature. Brendel saw that many of the young men's faces had turned green from the cold, but Austin's noble army did not have any tents, so there was nothing he could do. He could only patrol around to see if there was anything else he could help with. Count Audine's noble private soldiers, the Nagas, the students of the Royal Knight Academy and the Wyvern cavalry of the Southern Legion were not mixed together. The nobles' private soldiers were not as disciplined as expected. Considering that there were many girls among the students, Count Audine was afraid of causing trouble, so he personally restrained his subordinates. The Wyvern cavalry had to take care of their mounts, so naturally no strangers were allowed to enter. The grey Finn Nagas from the Shining Sea were used to the cold weather, but the dry land made them uncomfortable, so they rested under the riverbed, their bodies curled into a ball. For Brando, after his physical fitness reached the gold realm, sleep was no longer necessary. His metabolic system was self-improving, so it was normal for him to not sleep for a few days. He walked slowly along the edge of the black pine forest. The sky was dotted with stars, and in another world, it was rare to see such a beautiful scenery. Brando could not help but stop and look. However, cold winds were blowing from the southern mountain pass. The storm outside Ampere Seal was gathering again, and it was inevitable that the upcoming battle would be shrouded in a layer of haze. Brando suddenly heard the rustling sound of bushes being stepped on behind him. He pulled out his sword and turned around. A bright dress entered his eyes. Erwin's half-fairy princess had changed into a set of silver armor and a modified skirt. Standing in the forest, she looked noble and moving. "Mr. Brando." "Your Highness." Brando was slightly surprised. He didn't expect that the princess would still be awake and come looking for him. He didn't think that this was a chance encounter, and the princess wouldn't come to the forest for a walk at this time. He smiled awkwardly. "Why is your Highness here?" Princess Griffine looked a little lonely. She knew that she shouldn't have come here, but after leaving Ampere Seal, she couldn't fall asleep that night. When Brendel did such a rude thing to her, she was so disgusted that she wanted to kill him with her sword right then and there. But for the sake of Aween, she forced herself to calm down and compromise. She told herself that there were worse people in this kingdom, and she could even suppress her emotions in the face of Benninger's betrayal. But that scene was like a nightmare that left a shadow in her heart, and she couldn't forget it. If only this person's performance was worse, but he was so outstanding. Princess Griffine's silver eyes reflected Brando's figure, and her heart was full of complicated feelings. She had never seen love and hate for no reason in her entire life. Everything that happened that night made her believe that there was no such thing as an unconditional helping hand in this world. But so what if he pretended that he didn't want anything? He had already exposed his true colors, hadn't he? And Brando's identity as the descendant of Darius made her feel deeply worried. If the other party wanted something bigger, what should she do? But this was also her last chance. She hoped to get an answer in person, even if she had to give up more. As long as she could save Erwin and save Rose, she would persevere. Brando felt Princess Griffin staring at him, and couldn't help but blush a little. He didn't know how complicated Her Highness' thoughts were, but he could roughly guess the reason. That night, his mind was blank, and he couldn't help but, it was really a mistake that caused everlasting sorrow. It was too embarrassing to think about it. Back then, not to mention the princess wanting to kill him, if Princess Griffin just said a word, he would have been so ashamed that he would have killed himself. But after a day, Brando could pretend that it didn't happen. But now, being stared at by the half-elf girl like this, he still felt a little embarrassed. He couldn't help but cough and turn his head back. This subtle action surprised Princess Griffin. She was born in the royal family and was born with outstanding intelligence. She had seen a lot of intrigue, and she had inherited the elf sensitivity to the changes in people's hearts. She immediately felt the meaning expressed in Brando's action. So Mr. Brando also feels embarrassed. Princess Griffin's voice was soft, but crisp, like the gentle song of a nightingale in the forest. I'm sorry, that. Brendel was sweating profusely, thinking to himself, Your Highness, this is a shameless play. Although I know that I was in the wrong that day, you shouldn't have gone overboard. His soul in this life was only 19 years old, and in his previous life, he was an otaku who was not good at expressing his feelings. Although some of his original mentality had gradually corrected after a long time of ascension, he couldn't help but feel a little helpless at the moment. This guy actually blushed. Princess Griffin couldn't believe her eyes. She suddenly became curious, since Mr. Brando also knows that it is rude, why do you still do it? She couldn't help but gnash her teeth a little, that's too much. I thought Mr. Brando was a real knight. Brando was suddenly speechless. How could he answer? He couldn't say that a real knight was to pursue romance, right? That's too ridiculous. Or should he say that he will be responsible for her? That didn't seem too good. Not to mention that the princess didn't want him to be responsible. What about the little Roman? In his previous life, the one who had the deepest impact on him was actually his senior sister, but the past couldn't be chased, and the present couldn't be delayed. Brando was very clear about his feelings. Princess Griffin stared at him for a long time. She looked at Brando until he was in a terrible state. Finally, the half-elf girl sighed softly, I see, I understand. What do you understand? Brendel's heart skipped a beat as he turned to look at the princess in confusion. Looking carefully at the future heroine, the noble and elegant Princess Regent, she was just a girl who had just turned 16 years old today. She inherited the unique slender elves, which made her look even more delicate. Princess Griffin seemed to have untied the knot in her heart. She looked up, and her silver hair shone slightly under the moonlight. She smiled gently, lifted her skirt and walked out of the forest, quietly came to Brando's side, and also looked at the stars in the sky. Mr. Brando is also looking at the stars. Something like that. Brando replied a little absent-mindedly. He didn't understand what the princess meant. The astrologers said that after death, people will turn into stars, so the late king and father are also looking at us from the sky. This story sounded very romantic, but Brando knew that those were just burning big fireballs. Of course, he wouldn't say it out loud, and there were real astrologers in this world. Probably. Mr. Brando, you don't believe in fate. No, I believe in it. The princess was slightly startled and couldn't help but look back. She wasn't very tall, so she could only see Brando's broad shoulders. I believe in the Cruise people's epic. Fate is a struggle. Brando quietly repeated this sentence that his senior sister told him. Fate is a struggle. Princess Griffin carefully savored this sentence. Brando saw Maynard's figure from afar. She was covering a few ladies with her blanket. This detail surprised Brando a little. He didn't expect the cold-faced knight to have such a gentle side. After sending away Erwin's princess, Brando still felt a little confused. In the end, the half-fairy princess didn't say anything and just sat outside the forest with him, looking at the stars for a long time. What kind of attitude was that? He still couldn't figure it out. But all in all, it seemed that the princess didn't intend to pursue the matter, which was a good thing. Brendel heaved a sigh of relief. Otherwise, he would have lost a lot of face. At 3:00 in the morning, Brando finally saw the druid master named Walker. This person looked as abstract as Brando remembered. The first impression he gave was that he was a crow man. His face was sharp and long, and it was covered with black patterns. He wore a straw raincoat that looked like crow feathers. His arms and fingers were dry and slender, like claws. If this person was placed in the movies that Brando was familiar with, he would be a typical villain. But on the contrary, in history, this person had a cold personality, but strictly neutral image of an NPC. Of course, most druids were like this. Walker had rushed back from Ampere Seal. He looked tired, but according to the other party, he should be able to endure one or two more low-intensity battles. Brando hurriedly let him rest first. With this druid master, he quickly found that the mage group under his command had reached an unprecedentedly luxurious lineup. There were at least 4 gold-ranked spellcasters, the Archdruid Walker, the Law Wizard Great Teacher the Shire, the Sea Demon Bridget, and the Knight Lord Enrich. Then there was the Naga's 20-person priest group. Count Audine also had a few wandering wizards under him. In addition to the 2 sisters Pharaoh and Tia, except for the lack of an elemental rank pillar, this group of more than 30 people, with the lowest level being silver rank and above, could basically crush all of Erwin's forces. Unfortunately, the number of people was still too little in Brando's eyes. These 30 spellcasters were just enough for an army of thousands of people. It was not like the war in the future era of the Great Demonic Wave, where a legion could mobilize more than 100 spellcasters. In addition to being scattered in the army to be responsible for defense, they could also gather dozens of spellcasters to be used together to play the role of long-range fire support. Of course, this dream was just a dream for now. The survival rate of a wizard without a silver rank in a large-scale battlefield was extremely low, but there were very few wizards above the silver rank. This was the current situation of Wound. 4:30. The Royal Knight Regiment students finished their rest, and then the Nagas and the noble private soldiers were also awakened. Brando took out the map that he had organized overnight and let them set up the defense line according to the requirements. This surprised everyone again. They did not know that Brando was already familiar with the geography of the mountains and rivers in this area. They thought that the commander had personally brought people to survey the terrain in the night to let them rest well. Although the young officers did not say it out loud, they were very grateful in their hearts. Only Princess Griffin vaguely guessed something, but she could only bury it in her heart. The terrain of the Mar Highlands was a surprise for the defenders. The branches of the 3 mountains intersected here to form a huge valley. The valley was covered in dense fog, covering the valleys on both sides. The river flowed endlessly in the middle, making a loud sound of water flowing. In the north of the valley, there was a towering ridge that was almost leaden in the distance. It was hazy in the night before dawn. This was the end of the foothills that extended south of the Fama Mountains. The locals called this mountain Anchor Mountain. Anchor meant wall in the ancient language of the mountain people. 2 streams intersected at the foot of Anchor Mountain, converging into a shallow mountain stream. The stream flowed down the riverbank, and over the years, it formed a wide expanse of land. The land was like a huge slope, and on both sides were the forested Marchenko Mountain and Levico Mountain. However, Marchenko Mountain and Levico Mountain were flat and gentle, far lower than the height of Anchor Mountain. This meant that if they set up a position on top of Anchor Mountain, the archers would be able to attack the 2 mountains in the south from above. If the infantry and cavalry of the Northern Coalition Army wanted to attack them through the valley, occupying the two mountains in the south would be a nightmare. However, if they did not occupy the mountains in the south, attacking from below would not be as simple as a nightmare. This was simply a natural blocking position. Unless the Black Blade Squad found a way to cross the Fama Mountains and attack from behind Anchor Mountain. However, that would take a long time. At least for half a month, they would not have to worry about the enemy coming from behind. Therefore, the rest was simple. Although there were a few people who thought that it might be better to go deeper into the Anchor Mountains, it was only a possibility. Most of them started to set up a defensive line enthusiastically. The officers quickly came up with a very classic and practical plan. This plan was immediately sent to Brando, Princess Griffin, and Oberway. The plan was simple. As expected, the main position would be set at the north where the streams converged, at the foot of Anchor Mountain. The archer's position would be followed by the main position. However, the center of the defense would be pushed forward, including the two mountains in the east of Marchenko Mountain and the west of Leviko Mountain. Brando saw the core of the plan at a glance. They would set up a battlefield on each of the two mountains in the south. The young officers intended to use the terrain advantage to deplete the strength of the Southern Coalition army on these two fronts. This kind of tactical intent was very typical. It could be said to be a textbook arrangement. However, in Brando's opinion, it was not very good. It was too conservative. He glanced at the others. Princess Griffin did not say anything, and Oberway shook his head. A lone wolf is a lone wolf. Brando shook his head and said, "It is generally feasible, but the details need to be fixed." "Ah, how do you fix it?" Carglass, who was full of confidence, could not help but stare blankly. This plan was actually made by him, and it was unanimously approved by the officers. He thought that it would definitely be approved, but now it seemed that he was taking it for granted. "This will do." Brando used his hand to gesture twice on the temporary map and replied. "Ha!" Carglass' hand trembled, and he almost threw the plan in his hand at his lord's face. "This is called a plan. Isn't that the same as giving up the entire front line? Sir Lord, do you want us to surrender immediately? It would be faster." He looked at Brendel with pitiful eyes, as if he wanted to confirm that his lord did not speak nonsense because he did not sleep for the entire night. However, he did not expect that Brando would immediately glare at him and reprimand him. "What are you waiting for?" The young noble from Tonajul could only admit that he was unlucky and walked out dejectedly. "This seems a little." Oberway could not help but shake his head. Brando's plan was a little too bold, and it was a little beyond his expectations. No, it was more than just bold. If he did not know this young man before, he would have suspected that this young man was a spy. This plan was simply looking down on the intelligence of the Northern Alliance. You and Makarov have similar personalities, but it's a pity. The kingdom's lone wolf could not help but sigh. In the past, the kingdom had only one lion, one wolf, and one fox. But now, they could only rely on these young men. He could only hope that his choice was right. Only Brando smiled at this, full of confidence. The sky was starting to brighten, and the army was starting to gather in the forest. Noseide and his dragon riders took to the skies one by one in the morning breeze, and Brando controlled the wind spirit spiders to chase away the scouts in the sky. This was the cleanup work before the battle. At this point, both sides could no longer hide their intentions. The commanders of the Northern Alliance quickly understood that Brando was preparing to fight to the death with them. "You know that you can't escape." Williams reached out and caught the parchment that the dragon riders threw down. He looked at it indifferently and revealed a disdainful smile. He raised his head. The Mar Highlands were right in front of him. It was 8:12. Brando closed the pocket watch with a brass cover and looked at the other side of the valley. His vision was extremely far, and his powerful perception allowed him to see things a few miles away without relying on external objects. On the other side of the valley, the First Northern Alliance army appeared, but he could not see clearly which column it was. It should be Viscount Finn. There are quite a few of them, at least a few thousand. Count Audine put down his binoculars and muttered to himself, they stopped. They should be waiting for reinforcements. Brando nodded. Count Audine was indeed an old noble who had served in the Black Blade Squad and the Southern Army. His judgment was very accurate. He guessed that it should be Finn's column as well. Enrique, on the other hand, did not think much of it. The young man shrugged and said, "It doesn't matter how many people there are. It's already amazing that they can launch a frontal attack with 1,500 people. The Northerners are really dawdling." Freya stood beside Brando in her military attire. Her hand was on her long sword as she frowned and said, "But they can first attack the two mountains to the south of Marchenko Mountain and Levico Mountain, can't they? Then we'll have a good show to watch." Brando laughed. P.S. And so the main course begins. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 598. The sunlight was like a bright sword, piercing through the mist. On the highlands, flowers covered the ground, and rivers flowed as brilliantly as silver. But between the forests, rows of spears pierced through the mist. The Highland infantrymen in armor advanced side by side. Swallowtail flags and spear flags came into view one by one, each painted with the emblem of a leading knight, from a lion to a pelican, from a thorn to a garland. Finn's column, Constantine's column, Beale's column, and the Northern Coalition army were gathering. Spears pierced through the forest, and the snow-white tips rose and fell slightly with the breathing of the infantrymen, weaving a shining ribbon a few miles away. Looking into the distance from Mount Anchor, the south seemed to have become a dark ocean. Flags floated on the ocean, and from time to time, the reflection of weapons flashed across. Brando pursed his lips. This was the real battle. Only at this moment did he have the illusion of returning to the past. Everyone clenched the long swords in their hands, unaware that their hands had turned white. The private soldiers of the nobles even forgot to breathe, staring at the endless army with their mouths wide open. And behind the army, there was a steady stream of tales that were converging. Tens of thousands, this word only reflected its unprecedented pressure at this moment. Tens of thousands of people breathed at the same time, as if the wind was about to stop. The breeze on the Mar Highlands was calming down. The air became hot and stagnant, a sign that a storm was coming. On the green meadow, a knight was speeding away from the main formation of the Northern Coalition army. The knight held his spear high, trotting proudly in the northern position. "Look, that's the genius knight of the Harbor Covenant. The Count intends to appoint him as a column commander. I heard that it's to replace his father's position. A 20-year-old column commander. Because he's a genius. I heard that the Viscount fought a few beautiful battles against the Lion Men in Donitiquin, and won miraculous victories. The veterans who fought with him called him Vanag, did you know? Vanag is the legendary hero of the Highlanders. Veterans. It's the veterans who participated in the November War. He can command them. Only he can command them. I heard that the Count intends to train him to be the next Legion commander. That's just too ridiculous. That's possible. It's rumored that Lord Viscount is the last disciple of Earth Sword Saint Darius. Think about it, before Lord Sword Saint became famous, didn't people also call him Wanag? I don't think that's possible, but I heard that Lord Darius still has descendants, right? Who knows where he went after that? Maybe Lord Viscount is a descendant of that lord. After all, Lord Darius still doesn't want to see Erwin split. The soldiers discussed animatedly, and in the end, they couldn't help but feel deep veneration. During the restoration of the kingdom, Sword Saint Darius had left behind a legendary reputation in Erwin. His mysterious retirement in the end added to this legend. The commoners all believed that the Earth Sword Saint was the protector of the kingdom, and that one day, when the kingdom was in danger, he would come out with his sword. In the Amber Sword, such a saying was even widely spread among some players. Eruin players even improved the military swordsmanship left behind by Darius for this reason, but no one, including Brando, would have thought that the protector of the kingdom could not escape the trial of time in the end. And the last hope was also drowned under the ashes of Bucci. Brando stroked the long sword in his hand, and his heart was filled with disappointment. Viscount von Downing, however, held his head high and was in high spirits. If you looked closely, you would find that the rider wrapped in silver armor was the young man who stood next to Vitokin a few days ago. He was also the captain of the knight who clashed with Brando before the auction. He was the genius knight of the Neo people. Even the veterans of the November War admired him and thought that he might be the next Earth Sword Saint. Viscount von Downing also thought so in his heart. He raised his spear and rode the heavy drake around the Northern Alliance army's main camp. His cloak was like a golden flame behind him. Wherever he passed, the Northern Alliance army soldiers cheered and yelled, "Come on, let's go! Wagner! 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 Wagner!" The young man's forehead was covered in sweat, but he still held his head high and came to Count Vitikin's side. The Count nodded with satisfaction. The White Lion Legion was full of heroes, but the Black Blade Squad was not without successors, especially those who were praised by the veterans of the November War. This young man's battle with the Lion Beast men in the north could be described as perfect, just like the young sword Saint Darius. Although Count Vitokin did not care about the rumors circulating among the soldiers, if one day von Downing became the next Earth Sword Saint, then the Black Blade Squad might surpass the White Lion Legion one day. He took the long spear from the young man's hand. The commander holding the spear was an important belief of the Black Blade Squad, but now it was only a ceremony. Count Vitokin asked calmly, "Have you seen the position of the princess?" "Yes, Your Excellency." "How is it?" "Arrogant." Under the shadow of the foot of the Anchor Mountain, there were 3 huge square formations. Thousands of noble private soldiers were lined up in a long line on the north bank of the stream. The first 3 rows were holding spears that were 4 or 5 meters long, and the oval shields reflected the sunlight. These strange tower shields did not look like any of the human soldiers. Instead, they looked like the field troops of the Silver Elves, the throat of ANS. A heavy silver barrier lay in front of the Northern Coalition army. It's the genius of the Neo people. Brando was wearing a full set of knight's armor for the first time. He was sitting on the back of a warhorse in the middle of the square formation. When he heard Count Audine say so, he raised his head and looked at the complacent knight in front of the Northern Coalition army in the distance. The Black Blade Squad is fighting with the Golden Mane Lion Mane Beast men in the north. Viscount von Downing dealt with the enemy with less than a quarter of his troops. He penetrated the enemy's rear and burned the granary of the Golden Mane Beast men. He forced the Holy Cathedral of Earth to retreat temporarily. Makarov once said that this person would be Eruin's future general. "Mr. Brando, you have to be careful of this person." Princess Griffin reminded Brando in a low voice behind him. Brando's calm expression changed under his mask, and he chuckled. What did he have to be careful of? He should be careful of the other party. In history, this person was killed for Freya. Now that Eruin's Valkyrie was on the battlefield, this Viscount was in for a bad luck. Wolf Knight Oberway noticed Brando's expression and could not help but smile. "Why, it seems that Mr. Brando is acquainted with this person." Brando nodded. Not only was there an acquaintance, this person also owed him a duel. Princess Griffin did not let the sergeants form the core of the central position. The old knight lighter took the monocular away from his eyes. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes moved slightly as he gradually frowned. "Which army is that?" "Judging from the flag, it's Audine's private army." That's too arrogant. Marquis Balta also sighed. It seems that Her Royal Highness has underestimated the enemy due to her consecutive victories. I'm afraid this battle will be won in one battle. These words were exactly what most of the first-line noble commanders present were thinking. It seemed that Lady Martha still favored the North. Although the Cipher royal family had been deprived of their glory, the same could be said for the Corvado family. Count Vidokin could not help but close his eyes. He was glad that he did not choose the wrong side. They would definitely win. On the battlefield, the left and right wings of the princess's army extended back to Anchor Mountain, giving up the two mountains in the south, Marchenko Mountain and Veliko Mountain. It formed a huge battlefield zone with the center as its backbone. The main position became the center and protrusion of the entire battlefield. Her Royal Highness intended to use this axis to adjust the balance of the entire battlefield. Everyone could not help but sigh in their hearts. What a bold move, what a bold move. It was a pity. But as long as the Axis is defeated, the princess's army will lose its support. Viscount von Downing pointed to the shadow of Anchor Mountain in the north and analyzed in high spirits. The entire battlefield will be divided by our side. They will have to fight for themselves. Defeat will only be a matter of time. How can Oberway make such a mistake? He's the lone wolf of the kingdom. A noble officer asked loudly. Because he wants to pursue greater initiative. This is the character of the lone wolf. He will endure patiently and kill with one strike. The Viscount replied confidently. Where are the Nagas and the students from the Royal Cavalry Academy? They must be on the left and right wings. Viscount von Downing replied word by word. Everyone understood. Count Vidokin raised his head and stared at the shadow of Anchor Mountain for a long time. After a while, his gaze fell on the young man on the dragon's back. Viscount von Downing, do you dare to be the vanguard of the new king? Viscount von Downing was ecstatic. He knew that this was the best opportunity for him to become famous in one battle and leave his name in history. He immediately raised his head high. Of course. The messengers shuttled back and forth. The nobles' orders were intertwined and sounded in the plains. The flags of the Northern Coalition Army were being passed back and forth. Then, the army began to move slowly. Everyone held their breaths. Brando suddenly felt a chill on his forehead. The wind started to blow. Raise your spears. Advance, maintain the formation. The first to move out was the Beal column from Balthasar, 1. The Beal infantry wore only breastplates, halberds in their hands, wide-brimmed helmets, and loose breeches, which were fastened with iron gauntlets below the knees. The Beal infantrymen were well disciplined. Their uniform blue and white battle robes were connected together. Looking down from above, it looked like a blue and white ribbon on the meadow that was slowly separating from the Northern Coalition Army. Viscount von Downing was riding on a huge land dragon, leading his rangers to follow behind the infantry. As far as the eye could see, two thin lines of infantry traversed the entire valley. The blue and white lines were faintly discernible along the undulating terrain. Banners fluttered in the wind, and there were actually hundreds and thousands of them. Although they knew that this wave of attack was just a test, it was inevitable that they would feel a surge of excitement. This was the real battle. How many people could see it with their own eyes? Not to mention personally participating in it. Moreover, he knew that this would be the battle that would make him famous. From then on, von Downing would be another name that shone in Erewhon's history. He raised the spear in his hand and shouted at the top of his lungs, "I will take the lead with my spear. You shall win from me. Long live Erewhon! Long live the king!" His voice shook the plains. The Northern Coalition Army responded in unison. The cheers were earth-shattering. The roars were like ripples on water, causing ripples in the nobles' private soldiers under Count Audine. The private soldiers gripped the spears in their hands tightly. Their sweat flowed down like a fountain, but they did not notice. Count Audine looked at his nervous subordinates and could not help but sigh. This plan was too bold. How could his subordinates be up to it? He turned to look at Brando. Brando's face did not have a trace of worry. He was calmly listening to the princess beside him. I have heard from Oberway about Mr. Brando's heroic actions in Fortress Reden. I wonder what it was like when Mr. Brando launched his attack. Princess Griffin looked at the Northern Coalition army with a calm expression. At that time. Brando smiled. I didn't think too much about it. But people have to survive. It's the same for nobles and civilians. In front of life, there is no difference. Is this what Mr. Brando wants to tell me? The princess asked sharply. No, it's just a thought. Princess Griffin glanced at him. Brando was silently counting in his heart. He suddenly turned around and asked, Amandina, how much longer? Less than 10 meters, my lord. Amandina yawned behind him and answered softly with reddened eyes. The Beale infantrymen were slowly advancing along the valley in a row. To them, the princess's army's position on the north bank where the streams intersected was still a gray and unclear line. No one would have thought that they would be attacked at this time. The priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire who followed the army began to chant prayers. The hymn reverberated over the wilderness forest. From time to time, golden light would fall from the sky and bless the infantrymen. This was a flame protection spell. It was a large area blessing that added 1 point of defense and 1 point of fire damage to the recipient. However, the increased defense of this spell conflicted with the armor. Therefore, the lighter the armor, the better the benefits. It complemented the Beale infantrymen very well. But it was at this time. Everyone on the battlefield saw a sudden flash of light in the Beale infantrymen's formation. Several Beale infantrymen were suddenly thrown high into the air. Their corpses fell like puppets on the grassland full of blooming flowers. Then, a thunderous explosion spread throughout the plains. Background notes: Sad Face 1, Neo, a port developed from a fishing village near the Grey Mountains in the Yanalasu province. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 599. What was this? Magic? All the commanders of the Northern Alliance were so shocked that they stopped what they were doing. Even Viscount von Downing did not have the time to react. One after another, flashes of light exploded in the midst of Beale's infantry. Boom! 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 A storm of explosions enveloped the entire front line. This was the first time Beale's infantry had encountered such a deadly weapon on the battlefield of Wonde. The pyrolysis crystals buried under the grass immediately released all the energy contained within them. The terrifying impact not only lifted the grass, but also directly impacted the infantry on top of it. The Beale's infantry's iron gauntlets were first deformed by the impact, and then their bones were broken by the huge impact. They flew up along with their owners. Their breastplates instantly caved in during the process, and all the bones and organs inside were directly crushed into powder. 5 or 6 infantry were pierced into the air, and most of them fell back to the ground with cold corpses. In an instant, Beale's infantry had lost nearly a fifth of their strength. But the more serious blow was to their morale. They had not even come into contact with the enemy, and they were already in trouble. The cheers of the Northern Alliance's soldiers who witnessed this scene were like ducks that had been strangled by their throats. They stopped cheering in an instant. Is this what you made from the things you took out from the magic furnaces? Princess Griffin looked at the scene from afar, but she was silently calculating in her heart. The core of the mana conduction device is worth a lot, but those crystals don't seem to be worth it in terms of lethality. But in a critical battlefield, they seemed to be able to produce miraculous results regardless of the cost. Brando nodded. To be honest, both of them did not sleep at all after learning how to make this thing. In the end, because there were too many crystals, Amandina could not complete such a large amount of work on her own. He had no choice but to use the large-scale blood sacrifice alchemy formation to help. He had lost a lot of blood for this. But he noticed the expression on the half-fairy princess face and guessed what she was thinking. But he did not care. This was not the full power of the pyrolysis crystals. The best part was yet to come. He did not create the pyrolysis crystals to play with as a toy. He turned back and looked at the other side of the battlefield. The explosions were still going on, and one of the Drake riders had also lost his life in this round of explosions. The disintegration crystal had blown off his Drake's right leg, and the enraged Drake rider had thrown him off its back. This poor unlucky guy broke his spine in the process and died on the spot. Stop! Stop! Viscount von Downing was also shocked. He quickly pulled the reins and shouted, "It's a trap." However, the Viscount was worthy of his illustrious reputation in history. He immediately found a solution. He ordered Beale's infantry to stop and disperse, and then continued to advance in a skirmish formation. The skirmish formation had existed as early as the Year of the Stars, First 321, when Count Adeniel led the White Lion infantry to face the Lion Men's arrows. Earlier, the Cruz people had also used similar tactics, so it was not a novel invention. But he had learned and applied it flexibly here, and the commanders of the Northern Coalition Army were impressed. As expected of the genius of the Neo people, Viscount Finn could not help but praise beside Vitokin. The Count was also very satisfied. At least it did not prove that his choice was wrong. Being able to see through people was one of the virtues of the nobles. But before he could finish his words, as if to refute him, the battlefield was filled with an even brighter flash of light. The violent explosions were almost continuous, causing the entire valley to tremble. Viscount von Downing looked at everything that happened in front of him with his mouth agape. The violent explosions lifted the grass, and the soil soaked in blood fell around him, as if it was raining mud. He wiped his face, and his face was sticky and uncomfortable. In his imagination, the princess's side only had half a night to set up the formation and lay the trap. How could they have so much time? He thought that the other side was just bluffing, and wanted to buy time. But he did not expect that he was wrong about one thing. Brando's trap was not as complicated as he thought. In fact, he and Amandina just casually made some of the leftover scraps and threw them into the grass. But it was this product that brought a lot of trouble to the Northern Coalition Army. Brando saw the Beale infantry stop again, and he could not help but feel a sense of satisfaction in his heart. There were no international conventions in this world, and he could use any kind of mine he wanted without any psychological burden. And this was the first time this killing machine appeared on the battlefield, and it did indeed bring unimaginable benefits. If the Northern Coalition Army wanted to continue advancing, they would have to pay a terrible price. And the real purpose of these mines was to deter the enemy's morale. Losing one or two troops before coming into contact with the enemy was a terrible omen in the fantasy world of Wond. Of course, the other side could also stop and slowly clear the mines. Anyway, he and Amandina did not bury the exploding crystals too deep, and they could still find them one by one if they were careful. But that was exactly what he wanted. He was not short on time anyway, and it would be best if this battle dragged on for a week or half a month. But by then, the nobles of the north would no longer have the final say on the battlefield. But the Northern Coalition Army obviously understood this point, and did not intend to give Brando this opportunity. Viscount von Downing only stopped for a short while before ordering the Beale infantry to continue advancing, still in a scattered formation. This was purely using human lives to fill the hole. Beale's infantry immediately became restless, but it was immediately suppressed. Viscount von Downing ordered his cavalry to kill a few of the disobedient soldiers with a cold face, and the infantry brigade began to move forward reluctantly. But at this time, the heroic shout of "I will take the lead with my spear, and you shall win from me. Long live Erwin! Long live the king!" became a ready-made joke, and the morale plummeted. Viscount von Downing stared fiercely at the north, his face ashen. But no matter what, the Northern Coalition army finally began to move forward again. Amidst the explosions, Beale's infantrymen continued to lose men. In the end, these disciplined infantrymen could no longer withstand the pressure and collapsed. The lower-ranked soldiers cried and wanted to retreat, but the shining spears still drove them forward. This scene reminded him of the time when the Kurlutz Empire drove their slave soldiers to attack Awen. But the Kurlutz Empire drove away their enemies and captives, while the Awen Empire drove away their own people. He looked at this scene coldly. Behind him, Princess Griffine also bit her lower lip. The 1st Infantry Brigade of Beale's column finally collapsed or was completely finished. Not only did this brigade completely lose its organization, but it also lost its spirit. Everyone understood this point, and the Beale Brigade would not be called the 1st Infantry Brigade in the future. That would be a nightmare in everyone's heart. But this nightmare was still going on. Viscount von Downing replaced the 2nd Infantry Brigade, and at this moment, the young man seemed to have become a cold grim reaper guarding victory, coldly filling in the predetermined victory with human lives. He only needed the final result. As for the sacrifice, it was just a number. The Northern Coalition Army's advance finally saw results, and Beale's 2nd Infantry Brigade finally approached Brando's position, less than a mile away. Behind them, the main force of the Northern Coalition Army began to move forward, and Brando could even see the movement of the cavalry behind them. But at this time, Beale's infantry in front of them were hit head-on. Everyone heard a whoosh, as if the air was sucked out, and the sky darkened. Viscount von Downing subconsciously looked up, and saw a black rain of arrows rising from Mount Marchenko and Mount Veliko. The arrow rain hit them in the face, and Beale's 2nd Infantry Brigade that was advancing in front of them seemed to have hit an invisible wall, and their originally intact formation suddenly collapsed in several places. "We finally met the enemy." Viscount von Downing's heart flashed with excitement, and he immediately turned back and shouted, "Order the Highland Infantry to attack Mount Veliko immediately, and take down that mountain first." Beale's infantry continued to advance. The squire knight behind him immediately raised a bugle flag. At the other end of the valley, a bugle flag was also raised. Viscount Finn looked from afar and immediately rode out from the knight's encirclement. A knight behind him raised a bugle and blew it. The sound of the bugle from afar rang through the valley. Finn's Highland infantrymen began to leave the main formation. Thousands of grey-robed infantrymen flooded the riverbed at the bottom of the valley like a torrent. In front of them, the Beale's light infantrymen had already cleared a safe path for them, allowing them to attack Mount Veliko unimpeded. But unfortunately, the attack did not go as smoothly as expected. Finn's 2nd Highland Infantry Brigade had just entered the Black Pine Forest when they heard a hissing cry from the forest, "Sarko." If they understood the Naga language, they would definitely understand the meaning of this sentence. "Throw." Sani opened his mouth, and the long howl pierced through the entire forest. The Naga warriors who were hiding in the pine forest had already seen the human silhouette reflected in their yellow pupils. They raised their spears in unison and threw them downwards. Screams of pain rang through the forest. Finn's Highland Infantry Brigade's 2nd Highland Infantry Brigade's 7th Division was almost completely engulfed by the rain of spears. The leading centurion, Sir Raphael, died on the spot, and only 1/3 of the 150 infantrymen survived. Sani immediately ordered his men to lay down their spears, and the Naga Praetorian Guards raised their spears at the same time, and the first 3 rows immediately formed a steel jungle. The Highland Infantry Brigade's 3rd, 4th, and 9th Divisions had already passed their comrades. Centurion Broad and his comrades were personally supervising the battle, and when he saw the weapons in the hands of the gray-fin Naga in the forest, he knew that things were not going well. But it was too late to retreat, and everyone could only watch as the two armies of different races collided. A neat muffled sound rang out, as if the spears were tearing through chainmail. Broad could not help but raise his head subconsciously, and saw the first row of Black Blade Squad soldiers in front of him flew up neatly, and were thrown back, crashing into rocks or hanging on tree trunks. The Naga Praetorian Guards were still advancing, and the 3 divisions of Highland Infantry Brigades formation was like a thin layer of paper that could be easily broken with a single poke. A Tier 3 army displayed overwhelming strength against a Tier 1 army. Broad saw the Naga Praetorian Guards almost instantly clear out the human soldiers in front of them, and the Nagas at the back row were neatly taking out the second spear from their backs. This was the last scene he saw in his life. The forest was a mess, and the corpses of the human soldiers were nailed to the ground everywhere. Sani raised his head and looked. Brando had roughly told him about the structure of the Black Blade Squad, and the Naga Praetorian Guards had defeated about half of the human army, but this was enough. Collect the corpses of our people, clean up the battlefield, and retreat. Sani immediately ordered all his subordinates in the Naga language. Brando did not intend to tangle with the Black Blade Squad on these 2 hills. The students of the Royal Knight Academy had originally planned to turn this place into a meat grinder, but in his opinion, a meat grinder was not worth it. But if they gave up these 2 hills, could the central position really be defended? Sani's scorched yellow vertical pupils could not help but flash with a trace of doubt. When Viscount Finn arrived at Willico Hill, he saw a hellish scene. In just a short quarter of an hour, the 2nd Brigade of Highland Infantry Brigade had lost a total of 5 divisions and 4 centurions. He had not suffered such a tragic loss even when he was surrounded by the Lion Beast men in tows. And although the captain of the night squad had assured him that they had gone through an arduous battle to finally defeat the enemy, the Grey Finn's Nagas, and take over this hill, Finn was not stupid. He could obviously see that the Nagas had retreated on their own initiative, or else his men would not have failed to even get a single corpse. Forget it. Viscount Finn gritted his teeth. In any case, it was fine as long as he completed the mission. He would not take the initiative to ask for punishment from the Count for such trivial reasons. Clean up the battlefield immediately and report our victory to Count Vidokin. Finn ordered fiercely. He could not help but raise his head and look at the center of the battlefield. There was a faint sense of uneasiness in his heart. This battle was too strange. Why did the Nagas take the initiative to abandon the high ground? On the other side of the battlefield, the same thing was happening on Marchenko Hill. Baron Constantine could not believe his eyes as he looked at the fake White Lion Legion and the young officers who had almost completely defeated his column. They retreated. Mother Marcia above, are you protecting us from the heavens? Thank God. Baron Constantine lay on the ground weakly, almost crying, but no tears came out. Viscount von Downing almost immediately received the news that Marchenko Hill and Willico Hill had been conquered. At that moment, he finally heaved a sigh of relief. Although they had encountered some trouble, at least victory was in sight. Her Highness really intends to give up the high ground in the south to lure the main force of the alliance to attack the central position. She wants to cover the left and right wings. No, this should be a bait to lure the enemy in. How arrogant. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind, but his eyes gradually became fanatical and warlike. However, since the princess dared to expose her weakness in front of them, how could they let it go so easily? The enemy foolishly believed that their central position was indestructible, but Viscount von Downing did not think that Count Audine's private soldiers were reliable. Let's destroy their delusion with one blow. He raised his spear. The horn sounded. The bugle horn sounded once again. The Northern Alliance army no longer pushed forward layer by layer. Instead, it seemed that they were moving together. Since Marchenko Hill and Veliko Hill had fallen into the enemy's hands, they could finally fully unleash their full strength this time. Facing the enemy from three sides, Count Vitokin finally invested more than 4 columns of troops in one go. The black mass of troops was like a torrent across the mountains, but this torrent was going against the flow, launching an all-out attack from the river bank, from the streams, from the forests, and from the mountains. Flags flew in the wind, and the sporadic explosions of the collapsed crystals seemed to be drowned in the sea of people in an instant. At this moment, everyone could not help but turn pale. There were too many enemies. After losing Marchenko Mountain and Veliko Mountain, there was no doubt that the central position would be able to hold on under the pincer attack from 3 sides. Relying on those private soldiers. Brando's face finally showed signs of nervousness. He was not worried about whether there would be any flaws in his plan, but he was worried about whether Count Audin's private soldiers could withstand the huge psychological pressure. If they collapsed at the first touch, then it would all be over. However, he only had this one chance. He had to lure the enemy's main force here. "Hold on for me," Brando shouted in his heart, but he subconsciously pulled out his sword. Although he had not yet met the enemy, he could already feel that the noble's private soldiers were beginning to crumble. He could not wait any longer. He had to stabilize their morale. He raised the Halran Gaia high, and the behemoth's grip on his arm had the ability to transform itself, just like in the game. It perfectly integrated with the sky-blue armor. The metal gauntlet looked like the claws of a blue dragon, and it looked majestic. Behind him, in the archery position on the hillside, the noble archers finally received their orders. At the same time, they pulled out arrows from the quiver on their backs and drew their longbows. The arrowheads of the arrows had been removed and replaced with sparkling gray crystals. Bess looked at these longbowmen and could not help but shake her head. Their movements were slow and not standard. These nobles' private soldiers were really useless, and their numbers were too small. There were more than 1,000 archers, and half of them were temporarily transferred. Could these people really be of use? She was very doubtful. However, the commander had personally said that as long as they could draw their bows and shoot arrows into the enemy's formation, it would be enough. Bess looked at the black mass of the Allied forces at the foot of the hill and thought that it was not difficult at all. There was no need to aim at all. Ready, she also drew the shale longbow in her hand. Shoot! To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidyan. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 601. In Brando's field of vision, the distance between the sky and the earth became narrow and wide. The spearmen in front of him lowered their center of gravity, and their shiny helmets sank down one after another. Their spears seemed to rise from the sea of helmets. He vaguely heard Bess's shrill voice, like a siren's. Shoot! A rain of arrows flew over their heads, turning into black dots that fell to the ground in the distance. The formation of the Northern Allied Army was like a blue and white wave, and a series of explosions occurred in the wave. There were continuous explosions and flashes, and sharp whistling sounds. The sharp airflow seemed to have crossed a distance of dozens of meters in an instant, and the broken metal rings collided with his armor with tinkling sounds. Brando could not help but squint his eyes. The light infantry in front of him had begun their final charge. Their formation was completely in an arc, and they were crossing the shoals of the mountain stream. Disintegration crystals kept exploding under their feet, and a column of water rose into the air. Young faces fell in the mist, and their companions continued to move forward over their bodies. About 50 meters to the left and right of Mount Marchenko and Mount Veliko, the infantrymen of Finn's and Konstantin's divisions could be vaguely seen under the canopy of the trees. Flashes of explosions bloomed in the woods. Since they did not have to worry about friendly fire, the archers shot almost all of their arrows at the two mountains. The deafening sound of the explosions almost overturned the earth. The branches of the black pines were broken and blown away by the blast, and the flags of the two northern allied forces fell down one by one. Suddenly, a few flashes of light burst out from the battlefield. Brando immediately understood what it was. It was a magic attack. The wizards of the Northern Allied army had joined the battle. A few flames crossed thousands of meters in an instant, and in the blink of an eye, they became fireballs the size of a human head. But a light blue water curtain immediately opened above the nobles' private army. The fireballs crashed into the water curtain and turned into countless red flames that splashed in all directions. But the roar caused by the explosion still caused a commotion among Count Audine's private army, and the formation began to be messy and loose. Brando knew that things were not going well. He wanted to encourage the soldiers, but a clear and calm voice sounded before him. "Don't retreat, I'm here. I'll be with you and fight alongside you." Her Royal Highness's voice was firm and calm, but the girl's pale hand that gripped the hilt of her sword revealed her true feelings. "Your Highness." Brando suddenly turned around and saw Princess Griffin standing not far from him. Princess Griffin glanced at him, her silver eyes filled with unease. But she turned around and shouted solemnly, "I am the Princess of Erewhon. Today, I will let our blood flow together." The majesty of the royal family was still very influential among the commoners. Seeing that the princess was also standing behind them, the commotion of the nobles' private soldiers miraculously calmed down. Seeing this, Freya stepped forward and joined the first row. She drew her sword and stood side by side with the nobles' private soldiers. Although this girl from the countryside of Butchie was not good at words and actions, and did not know how to say any impassioned words to inspire people, as long as she held the Lionheart sacred sword with both hands and did not take a step back, the men would not be embarrassed to leave their positions and let her face the army alone. Behind her, the few Royal Knight Academy students who were still in the central position set an example and stood at the front of the line. No one spoke, but their bodies seemed to be shining with an indescribable spirit. At that moment, Brando's heart was thumping, but he also felt his blood boiling. He put down Halran Gaia and placed it in front of his chest. He raised his head and looked forward. A line of blue and white waves was passing through the smoke produced by the explosion. The light infantry of the Northern Coalition army had already crossed the river and was close at hand. Viscount von Downing passed through the explosion in agony, spitting out the sand in his mouth. He raised his head and looked through the smoke and fire. Strangely, he saw that Count Audine's private soldiers had just calmed down from the commotion. They also have brilliant officers. This thought flashed through his mind. The two armies crashed into each other with a loud bang. The nobles' private soldiers all stretched out their spears. The halberds in the hands of the Beal light infantry at the front were pierced before they could reach them. The sharp spears pierced through the Beal light infantry's slanted breastplates, and they fell to the ground in rows. From afar, the Beal light infantry's swallowtail flag at the front row collapsed like wheat stubble. The nobles' private soldiers took a step back, but the second row of Beal light infantry had already pierced through the forest of spears with their halberds. However, these halberds all hit the big shields in vain. The nobles' private soldiers at the back row pierced their spears through the gaps between the big shields and accurately pierced the fish that slipped through the net to the ground. However, the light infantry at the back row continued to move forward, passing over the corpses of their comrades. The nobles' private soldiers had no choice but to continue to retreat. Because the impact from each direction was not uniform, although the officers at the front row shouted at the top of their lungs, "Retreat! Retreat!" But the first row of battle lines still began to have continuous fractures. Brando was screaming in his heart, but he realized that the Beal light infantry on the other side did not make good use of these fractures. They were just advancing blindly. He then realized that he was only commanding a private army of nobles. The other side was just an irregular army formed by human light infantry that could not even be considered grade 1. He breathed a sigh of relief. He was really a little too neurotic. After all, this was only the year of the sword. The soldiers on the battlefield were not the famous soldiers of the future. He calmed down a little and raised his head. He saw that in the sea of helmets, shield tips, spear tips, and flags, there was a group of land dragon rangers cruising outside the formation in the distance. It's that guy. Brando realized that the other side was waiting for an opportunity, waiting for the fractures to expand to a point where the rangers could seize the opportunity. He subconsciously looked at the north foot of Mount Marchenko and Mount Veliko, and von Downing happened to do the same. The young Viscount rode on the land dragon's back and saw that the vanguard of Finn's and Constantine's divisions had already appeared at the edge of the forest. And right in front of them were the left and right flanks of the nobles' private army. They're advancing faster than expected. Viscount von Downing was slightly stunned. He knew very well what Finn's and Constantine's divisions were like, but he did not expect them to brace themselves and pass through the explosion at the crucial moment. God was on Cypher's side. But when he saw the same scene, a thought flashed through his mind: Bess did a good job. The nobles' private army slowly retreated with their backs against Mount Anchor, and the grey Finn Naga Praetorian Guards and the students of the Royal Knights Academy quickly appeared on their flanks at the south foot of Mount Anchor. Viscount von Downing instantly understood what Brando wanted to do. Concentrate the superior forces on the left and right flanks, lure and destroy the Northern Coalition Army's salient points at Mount Marchenko and Mount Veliko, and let the main force of Beale's infantry form a salient point to complete the encirclement. Signal the flag, Viscount von Downing immediately ordered. Tell Viscount Finn and Baron Constantine to hold on. Tell them that victory is in sight. He paused for a moment. Convey my order to Count Widukind. It would be best if you could ask him to give the same order again. The cavalrymen who passed the order immediately retreated. The battle was gradually becoming white-hot. Due to the repeated attacks, the formation of the nobles' private army had begun to slowly tilt to one side, like a huge piece of butter that had begun to melt, and one corner was seriously lagging behind. Viscount von Downing keenly grasped this change. He pointed his spear at the nobles' private army's flanks and shouted, "Concentrate on the left flank. Destroy their main formation first, and victory will be ours." Brando heard Count Audine roaring at the top of his lungs behind him. "Be careful of the rangers, don't expose the flanks to them." For the first time, he felt a sense of crisis approaching. His opponent was indeed a famous general in history. If it was only a battle of commanding an army, he might not be his opponent. "Mr. Brando," Princess Griffin's fair face was flushed, and the hand holding the sword trembled slightly because of excessive force. She looked around on the horse, and there were enemies everywhere, as if she was in an endless sea. "The left flank can't hold on any longer." Brando only nodded to her. "Maynard," he immediately turned around and shouted. "Yes. I'll hand over the command to you." Maynard turned around, and under her black hair flying, Brando saw a strange look in her eyes. But the female knight did not ask any more questions, and only nodded. "Mr. Brando, you..." Her Royal Highness was slightly startled. "What are you going to do?" Brando was turning his horse around, and the princess's surprised voice made all the junior officers and even the knight turn around. They were surprised to see their commander leave the front line and gallop to the left flank alone. What was he going to do? Under the suppression of the Allied army, the nobles' private army's left flank was clumsily retreating, and gradually became loose, and gradually squeezed into a small triangle. And as long as von Downing's Drake riders could go around the flank, it was only a matter of time before they collapsed. There was no turning back. Was the commander crazy? Viscount von Downing thought so too. Although he did not see Brando, the enemy's commander had not given up on the left flank and retracted the central formation. His reaction was too slow. He could not help but sneer. Perhaps he was too arrogant. No matter how brilliant the command was, it still required a qualified army to carry it out. The students of the royal family had no idea what a real war was like. He had already seen the flanks of the nobles' private army, and even the panicked faces of the country bumpkins. Those frightened faces were exactly the same as those of Cratenon's beasts. They were all the instinctive reactions of life in the face of despair. The rangers leveled their lances and began to accelerate. The ground trembled slightly. Every time the drake's huge claws touched the ground, the pebbles on the riverbank rolled and danced as if injected with magic. Dry dust rose into the air and formed smoke. But a shining lance cut through the smoke. Viscount von Downing lowered his body, and with a beast-like roar, he stabbed the lance in his hand heavily into the enemy's formation. The huge impact directly penetrated the oval-shaped shield, but the rangers continued to accelerate, and the drake riders knocked the shield away with their advantage of weight. The nobles' private army's formation collapsed in an instant, and they began to retreat. It was not until this moment that Viscount von Downing realized that he already had victory in his hands. Next, the defeat of Audine's left wing would sweep through the princess's main position, and then Beale's light infantry and his rangers would divide the battlefield, just like what they did to the stupid lion men on the battlefield in the east. But it was at this moment. He heard a distant howl. That cry seemed to have come from the dense forest, from the boundless wilderness. At that moment, the young Viscount seemed to hallucinate. He saw the darkness of the earth under the silver moon. Giant wolves were galloping. A long horn sounded, and then the forest shook. The howl of the wolves seemed to penetrate the forest in an instant, through time and distance, from far to near, one after another on the entire battlefield. Wolves. A black shadow blocked out the sunlight above Viscount von Downing. He looked up and saw the huge creature leaping high into the air. Its black fur shone under the sunlight, and its blood-red eyes were filled with cold killing intent. It was clearly afternoon, and the sun was brighter than fire, but the young Viscount could not feel a trace of warmth on his body. He only felt cold all over. He subconsciously raised his spear, and the spear pierced into the huge black wolf's fur, revealing the thick bone plates underneath. No, it was simply rock. The tip of the spear drew a spark on the rock. This was not an illusion, but a real existence. Viscount von Downing clearly noticed that the black wolf twisted its body in mid-air to avoid his attack, brushing past him and landing not far away from the drake. What a powerful force! Viscount von Downing felt his hand trembling slightly from the excessive force. He looked up and saw that in the shadows of the foothills of Anchor Mountain, hundreds of pairs of scarlet eyes were appearing. The wolf pack was galloping in the forest, and it was obvious that they were rushing in their direction. It's wolves. So many wolves. Behind him, Beale's infantry also discovered their new enemy at the first moment. In fact, everyone on the battlefield saw the black wolf tide pouring in from one side of the battlefield. The edge of the forest opened a black door of light out of nowhere, and the huge beasts were leaping out one by one. What a mess! Viscount von Downing finally reacted, and could not help but curse in his heart. But he did not have time to think more, because the cavalry was accelerating their charge. He looked back at the black wolf he was fighting with. The black wolf had been left far behind by the drake, and it did not seem to have any intention of chasing after them. Instead, it turned around and rushed towards the infantry behind. And all over the battlefield, countless black wolves were doing the same thing. It was as if they were an orderly and disciplined army. No, in fact, a real army would not be able to command so effectively. Viscount von Downing's heart tightened, and he suddenly realized that these wolves might not be as simple as the monsters of the forest. Were they druids? No, druids couldn't control magic beasts. Beale's infantry suddenly exclaimed. The Viscount immediately raised his head, and at that moment, he could not believe what he saw. The black wolf tide was parting to the left and right, as if making a path. And in the middle of the path, a man and a horse were passing through the wolf pack. It was Brando. Brando was also looking up at him. A black crystal slowly appeared on his forehead, flashing with a strange light. Brando placed the main position here, not because he believed in Audine's private soldiers, but because he believed in himself. It was not impossible for one person to fight against 10,000 soldiers. And now, he was using facts to tell the Viscount this truth. I am the left wing. The sky lit up slightly, and countless wind spirit spiders flashing with green light rose from the forest one by one. In the blink of an eye, they formed a huge light formation behind Brando. All of Beale's infantry could not help but watch this scene with their mouths slightly agape. A day ago, their wyvern cavalry had personally experienced the power of these little things, but now, it was their turn. Brando stood on the horse's back and pointed his sword forward. A golden-red rain of light poured down from the direction of his sword, and the dragon-roaming cavalrymen at the front were pierced through by the light pillars one after another. Over 100 cavalrymen were turned into ashes in the blink of an eye. But what made him slightly disappointed was that Viscount von Downing was indeed cautious. The moment the wind spirit spiders rose into the air, Viscount von Downing turned around and fled with a few of his guards, allowing him to escape this round of attack. After all, the attack of the wind spirit spiders had a certain delay. When Brando went to look for him again, he had already blended into Beale's light infantry brigade, and even abandoned his mount. He could not help but think that this guy was too cowardly. He did not know how Freya killed him. But this was not unexpected. After all, this guy did not even dare to duel with him in Ampere Seal, so he probably did not have much courage to speak of. After all, there were many nobles who would fight to the death with their opponents in order to protect their reputation. Brando shook his head and did not continue to order the wind spirit spiders to attack Beale's light infantry. He knew that the battle was far from over, and every bit of elemental energy he could leave was better than nothing. And the enemies in front of him were no longer a threat. In front of him, the combined army of black wolves and rock leopards was colliding with Beale's light infantry. However, hundreds of silver and iron pinnacle black wolves and rock leopards could only fend off the thousands of soldiers in this direction. Brando was waiting for an opportunity. And the commanders of Beale's division were also waiting for Finn's division and Constantine's division to complete the encirclement. Brando could not help but raise his head. Reflected in his vision were the mountains of Marchenko and Veliko that were shrouded in dense explosions. Viscount Finn was stunned by the deafening explosion and looked at Count Widekin's attendant in front of him. He shouted loudly in an attempt to drown out the terrible sound of the explosion. What did you say? You said that Count Widekin wants me to attack. Send in all our troops. The attendant knight nodded. Yes, my lord. Viscount von Downing has reported to Count Widekin how you risked your lives to send the vanguard into battle. Count Widekin also praised Finn's division for their tenacity, but both of them hope that you can send in more troops to support the front line. Victory is in sight. Both of them were shouting themselves hoarse, as if that was the only way they could hear each other. The whole mountain trembled, as if it was going to explode in the next moment. But Viscount Finn could not help but have an extremely strange expression on his face. When did he send the vanguard into battle? Didn't his vanguard get wiped out in the first attack? The opponent's spell was too terrifying. He had never seen a spell that could last for so long. Viscount Finn. Viscount Finn did not know what to say for a moment. How should he start? P.S. 5,000 words long chapter. Please for votes. All kinds of votes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 603. While Viscount Finn was speechless, Beale's infantrymen were in trouble. They suddenly realized that the Naga Praetorian Guards and the Royal Knight Academy's light cavalry had suddenly appeared on their sides. The vanguard of Finn's and Constantine's divisions, who were originally blocking the two armies, melted like snow and disappeared into thin air. When Viscount von Downing came to his senses, he realized that it was a trick. It was an illusion. Finn's and Constantine's divisions were firmly suppressed on Mount Marchenko and Mount Veliko. Their soldiers did not have the courage to cross the explosion and the sea of fire. However, Brando ordered the Naga Praetorian priests to use magic to create an illusion that the vanguard of the two divisions had already arrived. Using the water in the air to change the refraction of light to create an illusion, this was originally the specialty of the water elementalists, and the Naga Praetorian priests were the best among them. More importantly, Brando was familiar with every division on the opposite side. He could fake the battle flag and the knight's coat of arms to look exactly the same. Because of this, Viscount von Downing fell into this trap like a fool. Now, Beale's infantrymen had launched an attack on Count Audine's private noble army under his command, forming the only outpost of the Northern Allied army. The Naga Praetorian Guards and the Royal Knight Academy's light cavalry had circled around them without any hindrance, forming an encirclement. Viscount von Downing could only hope that Viscount Finn and Baron Constantine would suddenly appear and block the two armies. However, the explosion on Mount Marchenko and Mount Veliko had lasted for nearly 5 minutes. The enemy's archers were bombarding the two positions with arrows that could explode as if they were free, forming a barrage of bullets. He did not even have the extravagant hope that the enemy's longbowmen would stop to rest for a while because they had exhausted their strength. He only needed one glance to know that the enemy had at least divided the archers into several teams and used them in turns. And with the courage of the two good-for-nothings, it was unlikely that they would appear on the battlefield before the enemy ran out of arrows. Therefore, the result was very difficult to change. Now, it was Beale's turn to be attacked from the rear. Originally, they had the delusion of passing through the princess's main position, but Brando's appearance instantly shattered all their hopes. These light infantrymen were shaken in an instant. Although they were still resisting, it was only a matter of time before they collapsed in the encirclement. The changes at the front quickly reflected the entire battlefield. Count Widukind finally realized that he had been tricked. Now, he could continue to send reinforcements to rescue the light infantrymen of Beale's, but who knew if this was another trap? Or simply abandon Beale. However, the generals around him might not necessarily support his view. All the commanders of the Northern Alliance army on this battlefield were all nobles. Without the lips, the teeth would be interdependent. He SSSSSS, but he had to make a decision quickly S and they. And S was S ants. Were S the S's. The S though the dragon S. The valley was a huge slope. It was extremely strenuous for the S to charge from the bottom to the top. They only had one chance to defeat their opponents. Count Widukind, please make a decision. Widukind was surrounded by his old subordinates. How could they not understand that their lord was in a dilemma? They could not help but say in unison, no matter what decision you make, we will support you, my lord. Widukind smiled bitterly. The only way now is to think of a way to liberate Finn's and Constantine's. As long as they can appear on the battlefield on time, there is still room for redemption. Everyone's eyes lit up. This was indeed a solution. Why don't we order the Dragon S to join the battle? They are the only ones who can do this. Only by harassing the enemy's archers from the air can we rescue Viscount Finn and Baron Constantine. How could it be so simple? Count Widukind could not help but shake his head. However, he felt helpless because this was the only card he had. Although the Northern Allied army was powerful, they could not fully display their strength in this valley. If they could not take down the enemy in one go, this battle would take a few days. Undue delay may lead to many dreams. Therefore, the Black Blade Squad's dragon riders, who had been mobilizing for the entire night, began to take to the skies one by one. What awaited them was indeed the dragon riders of the Southern Legion, who were waiting for them at ease. In addition, Brando's Heaven's armor was always present. At least, that was what all the noble commanders of the Northern Coalition army thought. For a moment, the sky and the ground turned dark, but the effect was very limited. The Black Blade Squad and the Dragon Cavalry of the local troops were at least 3 times the number of the Dragon Cavalry of the Southern Legion, but their combat strength was uneven. In addition, the Dragon Cavalry did not have sufficient rest, so their combat strength was reduced by at least half. For a moment, they were suppressed by the Dragon Cavalry of the Southern Legion, who were far fewer in number. The commanders of the Northern Alliance army realized that things were not going well. Not only were Finn and Constantine's divisions not liberated, but the battlefield had also fallen into an even bigger stalemate. Ferd's heavy cavalry also began to speed up. The battlefield had already turned into a situation where there was no turning back. And this was the moment that Brando had been waiting for. The heavy cavalry of the Northern Coalition army was crossing the flower-filled plains. The wind and clouds gathered above their heads, and a new storm was gathering in the outer sea of Ampere Seal. The sky began to darken. If one stretched out their hand on the battlefield at this moment, they would see a light drizzle in the sky. Accompanied by the uniform footsteps of the Earth Dragons, the ground began to shake again. This time, it was different from the slight trembling of the Rangers' charge. Instead, the entire battlefield seemed to be roaring, like rolling thunder, sweeping from the horizon. And above the sky, real thunder was also faintly roaring. "Siren, please attack those heavy cavalry with your men," Brando suddenly shouted. Bridget looked at the human heavy cavalry calmly. This was the first time the Grey Fin Nagas fought against humans on land. This was also a valuable experience for them. She raised her hand halfway, and between her 4 slender and long fingers were colorful webbing. It looked very strange to humans, but it also had a feminine beauty. The Naga siren once again began to cast spells, and ice blades once again appeared above the battlefield. On the other hand, their human opponents had yet to catch their breath. As Silver-tier elementalists with a single element, and with the blessing of the sea god, these siren priests had a far greater advantage in terms of magic power compared to their peers in the Northern Allied army. They could support them in returning to the battlefield in a much shorter period of time. But to Bridget's surprise, before they could control the landing point of the ice blades, the whole space seemed to have quieted down for a moment. Suddenly, countless silver lines of law were born between the clouds. These lines shrouded the entire battlefield, weaving a huge boundary. In an instant, all the spells disappeared without a trace. Disassemble incantation. Bridget frowned. Disassembling incantations was the specialty of law adepts. But with such a large area of effect and such a powerful effect, the opponent had to be at least an elemental rank wizard. Bridget was obviously not familiar with the power of humans, but Brando knew who it was. The chief wizard under Duke Cypher, Garlock the Wanderer, and one of the top law wizards in Erewhon. The opponent could not wait any longer, but finally this guy made a move. That was enough. He immediately turned around and shouted, "Amandina. I'm here, my lord." The noble girl shouted in the crowd. "Now. I understand." Everyone, Brando suddenly raised his head and roared to the sky, "Cover your ears." Ha! The situation on the battlefield was ever-changing, and even everyone on the princess side was stunned by the wolves that Brando suddenly summoned. Her Royal Highness and Oberwe were not ignorant people. They recognized at a glance that those were black wolves, which were not considered high-level magic creatures in the Black Forest. But according to the legends of the mountain people, black wolves only appeared in packs during disasters, and that was the calamity of wolves. "Mr. Brando, he Princess Griffin's jaw dropped as she stared at the black crystal on his forehead. Her face was pale as she asked, "That is?" Oberway also frowned. Only Count Audine laughed. "The Lord of Darkness herds wolves, before the end of the world, disaster follows." The saying that the black wolves are a sign of disaster is just a nonsense rumor of the witches. Only the mountain people are ignorant and superstitious. I have seen the real calamity of wolves in the loop of trade winds. But even if it is a disaster, humans can overcome it. It was Mr. Brando who made me believe this. Count Audine laughed. "Someone can bring light in the darkness. I have seen all of this with my own eyes." Princess Griffin remembered his experience and nodded slightly, but she could not help but look at Brando curiously. But what everyone did not know was that further away, in the forest on the top of Anchor Mountain, an old voice was softly chanting the same words. "The Lord of Darkness herds wolves, before the end of the world, disaster follows." In his eyes, there are no secrets in the world. The prophecies are being verified one by one. "My king, you are indeed back." Brando's long roar shook the forest, and even the black wolves beside him stopped. The next moment, everyone felt the ground shake slightly. It was not the vibration caused by the heavy cavalry running, but the whole valley shook. Large groups of soldiers fell to the ground as they lost their footing. The heavy cavalry of Ferd's column was even worse. They had just started to accelerate, but they fell to the ground in rows. A large number of knights had broken their necks before they could even enter the battlefield. But no one cared about what was happening on the battlefield. Because a terrible roar was coming from the ground, everyone could not help but look down. The ground was shaking slightly, as if there was some terrible energy brewing below. The faint roar was like the roar of a giant beast. And it was approaching. The source of the loud sound was rapidly approaching the ground, and then everyone looked up. Suddenly, there was a flash in the gloomy sky. It was as if a bolt of lightning had illuminated the entire battlefield. However, that bolt of lightning didn't descend from the rolling dark clouds. Instead, it came from underground. In the direction of Marchenko Mountain, there seemed to be an opening, and a dazzling white light gushed out from below. "Viscount Finn is finished." Count Widokin saw this scene and only had one thought in his mind. He suddenly realized something, turned around in horror, and shouted to his subordinates with his mouth wide open. However, in the vast expanse of white light, a loud sound seemed to drown out everything. After a sharp sound, everything fell silent. Everyone saw the people around them shouting in horror, but they could only see their mouths opening and closing, and no sound came out. The loud sound waves even swallowed all the noise, but strangely, it made the world quiet down, and no one could hear a single sound. Then, the terrifying sound of an explosion swept past like a gust of wind. Everyone subconsciously stepped back, and the terrifying shock wave swept across the battlefield like a bright ring. Then, whether it was the light infantry, heavy infantry, or the knight riding on the drake, they were all lifted up by the gust of wind and flew back more than 10 meters before falling back onto the meadow. At that moment, the whole valley shook, as if the northern branch of the Erek mountain range was about to collapse. The white light instantly cut off the connecting section between Marchenko Mountain and Weliko Mountain. After a long time, when Widokin finally got up from the ground and regained his senses, he looked at the battlefield in front of him and could not help but feel his mind go blank. The heavy cavalry of the 3rd Division had completely disappeared, and half of the heavy infantry had disappeared. On the other side, Stevenson Division had also disappeared by nearly a third. Marchenko Mountain had almost disappeared, and Weliko Mountain had been cut in half. There was only a deep rift valley left on the ground between the two mountains, and the bottom of the rift valley was like an abyss, surrounded by white fog. But before Count Widokin could find any suitable order in his muddled mind, the dense white fog seemed to come alive. It kept rising up and then combined into a huge, spinning tornado. Everyone who was still alive could not help but look up at the rapidly expanding storm that was dozens of meters above the ground. It was clearly not just a gust of wind, because everyone felt a huge pressure descending on the battlefield. And then, a majestic voice resounded throughout the battlefield. "Lowly mortals, thank you for breaking the seal for me," a thunderous voice came from the wind. The storm clouds in the sky were gathering above its head, and the rain on the battlefield seemed to have become heavier in an instant. Lightning began to shuttle between the clouds, and then the lightning gathered on the tornado. But I hate it when people disturb the elegance of the silent wind. Amidst the rain. Everyone around Brando was stunned by this sudden change, but he was the only one who looked up at this very familiar scene. He only felt a sense of wonder in his heart. Even the opening lines haven't changed. Then this guy's temper shouldn't have changed much. Ha! On the other side of the battlefield, Garlock the Wanderer's face suddenly changed. The great wizard, who was casting a spell, suddenly turned his head and shouted anxiously to Count Vitokin, "Get your men ready for battle, quick, or it will be too late." In fact, it was already too late. The storm suddenly let out an extremely dissatisfied snort. "What is this?" In the cloud cluster, a silver line of law was looming in the air, and then a bright arc burst out. Disassembly incantation. You actually used a disassembly spell to attack me. You are courting death, vermin. Garlock raised his head and looked at the countless lightning vortexes that suddenly appeared above his head. Then, countless lightning bolts extended from these vortexes. For a moment, lightning and a storm intertwined on the battlefield. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 604. Count Vitokin would never have dreamed that an arrogant behemoth would suddenly appear on the battlefield between the two armies. Even in legends, there was no such bizarre thing. But of course, he would never have thought that this was actually Brando's masterpiece. As early as the night before, Brendel had already buried a large number of disintegration crystals in the seal nodes of the Holy Cathedral. Once the time was up, the seal would naturally explode, and then the Rager Adega, the huge storm elemental that was swaggering on the battlefield, would naturally break free from its leash. Rager Adega was level 71 in the game. In terms of Vaunt's general understanding of strength, he was at the late stage of the lower realm. It could be said that he had reached the extreme realm at his peak, but his strength had declined after being sealed. Since this guy was called the Rager, his temper was naturally not good. Due to the contract, Tiamat Code, between Lady Martha and the four Elven Kings, elemental creatures were naturally sensitive to changes in the law. Lord Adega also hated it when people showed off their law spells in front of him. This was why the Shire had never made a move until now. As a veteran player, Brando would never make such a low-level mistake. But the Northern Coalition army was not so lucky. Garlock the Wanderer had a bad feeling as soon as he made his move. This great mage was already level 65 at the beginning of the game, and he was also a powerhouse of the elemental truth. Powerhouses of his level were usually very sensitive to danger and hostility. He immediately sensed Adega's hostility towards him. Adega was like a huge cloud hovering in the sky above the battlefield. Just its diameter alone was more than a few hundred meters. Gray clouds were constantly churning in its body, occasionally releasing one or two bolts of lightning. Everyone had to look up to see the full appearance of this lord, and in the position of its eye sockets, there were two huge lightning vortexes, like electric balls. As soon as this behemoth appeared, the soldiers of the Northern Allied army immediately let out a terrifying scream. God, it's a monster. Nonsense, that's an elemental creature. So big. There were quite a few people who turned and ran, but Adega did not intend to bother with them. With a soft sound, a golden lightning arc flew towards Garlock, who was in the middle of the battlefield. The old wizard's face turned pale. Elemental creatures had a long lifespan, so they were much stronger than humans of the same level. Not to mention, this one had been sleeping for countless years, and its strength was one level higher than him. He quickly raised his right hand and shouted, "Law, stop it." A transparent hexagonal shield floated above him, each side blocking the front of an electric arc. When the two sides collided, the electric arc immediately scattered into electric snakes that splattered in all directions. Adega didn't expect the human below to have some strength. Of course, it was also because his strength had declined. He couldn't help but feel a little angry. It took a deep breath, and the clouds that made up its body suddenly expanded. At this moment, a storm was forming in the outer sea of Ampere Seal. Heavy rain fell again, and Adega seemed to be drawing energy from the storm. An arm made of dark clouds suddenly grew out of its body, and then with a whoosh, it crossed half the distance of the battlefield and slammed down on Garlock's head. Although this huge storm elemental was huge, it was not cumbersome. Due to its speed, the soldiers on the battlefield seemed to have just seen the change in the clouds in the sky. The next moment, a giant fish, nearly 20 to 30 meters wide, made of dark clouds and intertwined lightning, was right in front of their eyes. There was a loud bang. The lightning sparks seemed to converge at one point, but as if they had encountered some kind of obstruction, they spread out from this point, forming a spiderweb that threw back countless electric sparks. The scene was like a rushing current hitting a rock in the middle of a river and splitting it to both sides, except that the current was made up of golden red lines. The electric arc was thrown back, and behind Garlock was a dense phalanx of longbowmen. These ordinary human soldiers immediately suffered. The electric current washed over their position like a flood, and dozens of longbowmen were burned to charcoal before they could even scream. The luckiest one lost at least an arm. After the electric arc, the old wizard below was revealed. Garlock's face was pale, and his right hand was trembling slightly. He had to thank the amber sword for not requiring guidance for most of the protective spells. Otherwise, the power of this slap alone would have shaken him to the point of foaming at the mouth and paralyzing him. Elemental creatures were natural elementalists, but this did not mean that they were weak. In fact, unlike the weak races like the Iron Folk, most of the high-grade creatures were capable of both magic and martial arts. A powerful elemental lord like the Storm Elemental, after reaching the peak of the realm, would not be inferior to an elemental-activated warrior in physical strength. Adega's attack missed again, and the bad-tempered elemental master suddenly flew into a rage. Countless lightning bolts shot out from his body and landed on the battlefield, taking out his anger on the ordinary soldiers. It could be said that he was the most shameless boss in the history of Erewhon. A large number of casualties suddenly appeared on the battlefield. Count Vitokin almost blacked out when he saw this scene. At this time, Duke Cypher, who had been supervising the battle from the back, finally could not sit still. Although everything that had happened in the past 2 days since the appearance of the Ash Sword Saint was beyond his expectations, he finally felt that things were getting out of control. It seemed that Her Royal Highness was not so easy to catch. Although he cursed in his heart that Her Royal Highness had been killed by Adega's lightning, Duke Cypher still had to order his personal knight to take action. Before Adega had time to retract his palm, a dazzling golden flame suddenly burned out of thin air in the torrential rain. A long sword burning with raging flames slashed down with this flame, cutting right into Adega's hand. After all, elemental creatures were not incorporeal creatures like ghosts, not to mention that in the Amber Sword, even incorporeal creatures would suffer half of the damage. The Storm Elemental had 25% physical damage immunity, but this sword still directly cut off its palm. To outsiders, the Storm Elemental was just a whirlwind, and even if its hand was cut off, it could still be reattached. But in fact, elemental creatures were also creatures, and any part of its body was the most direct reaction of energy. It could absorb the power of the storm, but it did not mean that it was the storm itself. Therefore, Flaming Nicholas' sword really cut into its body, causing Adega to let out a scream that shook the forest. Adega was really furious this time. Don't forget that he was not only a supreme master at the peak of the law, but also a boss. Brando knew that even in the real world of Wond, most of the time, it still followed the settings of the Amber Sword. Unfortunately, Flaming Nicholas and Garlock did not understand this. Suddenly, a circle of golden arcs appeared around their bodies. Lightning Cage. This was the second stage. When Adega the Rager appeared, the battlefield was divided into two. Because he knew the breaking point of the seal in advance, Brando lost almost no soldiers in the explosion. Except for a few guys who were blown away and injured by the explosion, there was the idiot Carglass among them. The Northern Coalition army suffered heavy losses. The Finn column and Constantine column, who were lured into the two mountains by Brando in advance, were completely annihilated along with their commanders. The heavy cavalry and heavy infantry of the Field column were almost completely annihilated. Sir Field was lucky not to die, but he was captured by the sergeants of the Wongley Knight Academy who arrived later. 3 columns, nearly 12,000 people, were completely out of the battle. The Northern Coalition army and Brando fought for half the morning, but their losses were not even half of this. This loss was considered a heavy one for the kingdom, even in all the previous battles. Not to mention, the light infantry of Beale who were originally on the battlefield were either killed or captured. As Adega's attention was completely attracted by the unlucky Great Wizard beside Duke Cypher, Brando took the opportunity to order his men to clean up the battlefield. Thus, the light infantry of Beale became the abandoned pawns on the battlefield. After losing hope, they could only disarm and surrender. As a result, the Northern Coalition army lost 4 columns on the battlefield, which was at least a third of the enemy's forces. Moreover, the monster Adega was still here, and the Northern Coalition army still had a lot to do. Brendel raised his head and looked into the distance. There were already 2 huge electric cages on the battlefield. He couldn't help but laugh. This time, Nicholas the Blazing and Garlock the Seeker were going to suffer a big loss. Sure enough, Nicholas the Blazing and Garlock the Seeker were shocked by the circle of electric current that appeared around them. They were both elementalists, and as long as they stepped into the elemental realm, each of them would have their own unique line of law. One truth was that it was difficult for the laws of the outside world to enter their bodies without touching their line of law. This was just like how Brando had difficulty controlling the line of law and using the true hit skill to control the Temple Knight. Nicholas the Blazing and Garlock the Seeker did not even think about this possibility, so as soon as the circle of electric current appeared around them, they were caught off guard and slammed into it. Brando could almost imagine their screams. Although both of them were respectable people and had strong characters to be able to reach this point, they did not make a sound. However, this did not mean that they were not injured. In fact, 2 bright electric lights burst out over the battlefield at that time. When the electric lights receded, Garlock the Seeker was still fine. After all, he was a wizard and had many life-saving magic items on him to help him withstand the blow. Nicholas the Blazing was a little embarrassed. His beautiful flame-colored long hair was all burned away, revealing a big shiny bald head. His body was still emitting white smoke. It seemed that this guy would not be called Nicholas the Blazing in the future. In fact, Brando had even thought of a nickname for him, Nicholas the Embers the Bald. Of course, Brando, or Sophie, had a dark heart, but that was not to be mentioned for the time being. In fact, he had already expected what would happen to Nicholas the Blazing and Garlock the Seeker. The lightning cage was a sign that Adega the Rager's battle had entered the second stage, and this world was no exception. This was actually a boss skill. There was nothing strange about it, but one of its biggest features was that it could ignore the influence of the lines of law. Probably only elemental creatures, who were naturally sensitive to the laws, could create such an incredible skill. The actual effect of this skill was that unless you remained still and did not leave the range of the lightning cage. Otherwise, once you touched the arc, you would immediately lose half of your life. Although the damage of this skill could be absorbed by some magic equipment such as shield rings and life-saving amulets, it ignored all defense and magic damage reduction. In other words, even if Brando had more than 100 will, he would still suffer the same amount of damage. In the beginning, the players had a hard time dealing with this skill because the lightning cage would last for 10 seconds and was cast on all targets with Adaga's aggro on the field. This meant that you could not dodge in these 10 seconds and could only stand and defend against all of Adaga the Rager's attacks. This was a nightmare for the players at that time. But what made Brando a little funny was that this skill was not so threatening to Nicholas the Blazing and Garlock the Seeker. When the players first explored this boss, their levels were not as ridiculous as these two. One was level 70 and the other was level 71. At that time, the highest level of the players seemed to be level 55. It could be said that Nicholas and Garlock were fully capable of resisting Adaga the Rager for 10 seconds, but they were at a disadvantage because they were not familiar with the skill. Most of these elemental creatures came from ancient times, and their skill system was completely different from today's. Before Brando could finish thinking, he heard a thunderous roar on the battlefield. Ha ha ha, stupid mortals. Adaga's laughter was extremely arrogant. It seemed that it was very proud of its success. Under my lightning cage, you'd better obediently wait for the lightning's judgment. If you act rashly, you'll only lose more than you gain. The loud voice echoed on the battlefield. F***ck Brendel almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Even though this guy's title was Adaga the Rager, the players actually called him Brain-Dead Adaga. This arrogant guy had an extremely bad habit of showing off his skills, as if he was afraid that others would not be able to defeat him. Brendel did not expect that he would behave the same way here. Nicholas the Blazing and Garlock the Seeker were both masters of Erewhon who had been famous for a long time. They were very sharp. They looked at each other and saw the same meaning in each other's eyes. Sure enough, as soon as the lightning cage appeared, the two of them would be immobilized, and then Garlock would cast a defensive spell. For a while, Adaga could not do anything to them. At this moment, the battle was in a stalemate, but it was obviously in Brando's favor. In the eyes of the princess, this was the best time to retreat. If Adaga could delay the Northern Coalition army here for a day, they might be able to escape Ampere Seal completely. However, they did not expect that Brando did not seem to have any intention of retreating. Instead, he stood in the pouring rain and watched the battle calmly. What the hell was this? The princess was too embarrassed to give orders to Brando, so she called Freya over to ask what was going on. Unexpectedly, the future Valkyrie of the kingdom also replied with a natural expression, Brando is like this. It's as if he doesn't know what's important and what's urgent. When he was escaping in Butchie, he was clearly about to die, but he still learned first aid from me. It's so infuriating. I'm not asking you about his character. The half-fairy princess sighed and said, Freya, why don't you ask Mr. Brando if we should retreat first? Freya finally understood and nodded her head seriously. She then led her warhorse over to inquire about the situation. Retreat? Brando was slightly stunned. At this time, the Mar Highlands Sanctum Ruins dungeon was already in battle mode. According to his experience in the game, players who chose to leave the dungeon area at this time would become Adaga's main target. Although he did not know if the real world of Wound had such a ridiculous setting, Brando did not intend to provoke this somewhat muddle-headed elemental master. No, we can't retreat now. Exactly the opposite. Let everyone rest for a while, we'll prepare for the next battle. Brando raised his head. Cruz's people had not yet appeared on the battlefield, and he did not think that the Holy Cathedral of Fire would give up so easily. Even if Cruz's people did not intervene in Erewhon's civil war, it was natural for them to help them deal with a wind elemental. The battle was only halfway through. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 605. The Cruise People's epic, Pale Poem, mentioned that the 4 elven kings and their subordinates were the guardians of this world. However, this agreement was only between them and Martha. These elements were violent and furious, and humans rarely got along with them, just like now. After the lightning cage failed to work, Adega the Rager directly jumped into the 3rd stage. Brendel was shocked when he saw this. He immediately lost the mood to watch the show and shouted, "Your Highness, please order everyone to retreat to the foot of Anchor Mountain immediately." Everyone was still confused, but suddenly there was a muffled sound from the ground, like the roar of a building collapsing. They looked up and saw that in the crack where Adega was, countless angry whirlwind elements rushed out from the ruins of the Holy Temple. At the same time, the purple-black thunder clouds in the sky began to surge and began to rain down lightning storms. That scene was like the final judgment described in the Book of Dark Prophecy. The world was filled with scenes of doomsday. Lightning and fire descended from the clouds, and the Knights of Dusk rode in the rain of fire, burning everything to ashes. Everyone's face was pale, and Count Audine's private soldiers were even more frightened. Princess Griffine's face was also pale, but she calmed down and immediately ordered, "Count Audine, the officers of the Royal Knight Academy, please retreat to the direction of Anchor Mountain immediately. Mr. Brando, please lead our Naga allies and retreat together." Brando looked back at the scene of heaven and earth collapsing. Among everyone present, he was probably the only one who did not feel afraid. Instead, he felt that the scene was so familiar. The desire of a player to explore and adventure burned in his blood. He turned his head again and added, "Remember, do not leave the range of this valley." Princess Griffine looked at him and nodded seriously. In fact, there was no need for orders. The dragon riders of the Southern Legion in the sky had already begun to retreat. After everyone had entered the forest. The last to leave was the Grey Fin Naga. When the sea monster Bridget passed by Brando, she looked at him with her beautiful bright yellow eyes and said in a hoarse voice, "You are not a good commander, but an excellent prophet." Brando's heart skipped a beat as he looked at her in confusion. "You don't have to be surprised. The water told me everything." The sea monster, Bridget, bowed to him and slid into the forest with her ceremonial blade. Her long tail was like a snake. "What did she say to you?" Sonny asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Bridget was one of the Grey Fin Nagas, and he had never seen her color a male creature, be it Naga or human. She said, "I'm a scammer." "Do I look like one to you?" Brando turned around and smiled. Sonny thought for a moment and replied seriously, "I think so." It was indeed very similar, so much so that Princess Griffine waited for everyone to go up the mountain, one step behind Brando to come up last. She looked at the man carefully with her silver eyes and asked, "Mr. Brando, did you already know that this monster was sealed in the ruins of the temple under the Mar Highlands?" She asked the question that was on everyone's mind. If that was not the case, it would not explain why he insisted on fighting the Northern Coalition army here. Moreover, he was the one who ordered the production of the disintegration crystals, so he could not hide the fact that he ordered a group of lizard men to transport the crystals underground. Incidentally, he was also the one who discovered the tunnel that led to the underground. Too many coincidences were no longer coincidences. Brando knew that he could not hide it, so he nodded. Yes. A black wolf the size of a horse passed by him and rubbed its head against his shoulder intimately. Brando touched its furry forehead. The wolf pack passed by the two of them. The princess had only heard of such a strange scene in legends, and she could not help but hold her breath when she experienced it for herself. The Erech Highlands was once the holy land of the Silver Elves. There are many secrets buried here. This temple is one of them, and the other is near Fail. That ruin is much bigger than this one. The ancient war buried a lot of history underground, but it is still recorded in the ancient books of the wizards. Brando answered. The princess was silent for a while. She already knew that Brando knew many secrets that ordinary people did not know. But no one knew how he grasped all this knowledge, as if he was born to know everything. She thought for a while and asked, Mr. Brando. No, the descendant of the Sword Saint. You said that you know nothing about your grandfather's deeds, but your experience is like a legend to us. You overcame difficulties that ordinary people could not imagine to reach where you are today. We all know that your future is limitless. If you want, status, power, and even, women are all at your fingertips. But why did you choose to help me? There was one thing that she did not ask. Looking back, it was not hard to see that Brando's every move since he left Fortress Reden was for this day. He did not hide his good impression of her, the Princess of Erewhon, and unconditionally helped the royal family of Covardo during their most difficult time. If Brando came here because of the will of Sword Saint Darius, she would not be surprised. But that was not the case. Brando's legend was his own epic. He did not even know that his grandfather was the famous sword saint in Erewhon's history. Princess Griffin did not believe that there was love without reason in this world, just like there was no hatred without reason. She still asked this question. Brando scratched his head. It was not that he did not think of this question, but it was hard for him to answer. He could not say that the love and hatred from his previous life had been passed down to this soul, could he? Ugh. Maybe it's because some people are born to be helped. Besides, the princess is so beautiful, is she not worth helping? Does Mr. Brando intend to use this answer to brush everyone off? I think even your subordinates need a reason, right? Griffin asked calmly. This really hit Brando's Achilles heel. He turned around and noticed that Carglass and Amandina were quietly observing the situation. Indeed, his actions in the past could cause people to gather around him to not ask for a reason. They believed that he could lead them to create a miracle. But saving an aging kingdom required more than a miracle. One day, they would need a common goal. Actually, I don't understand either, Your Highness. But I believe that the kingdom also had a revival, but it was fleeting. One or two strong people could not change history. Perhaps what the kingdom needs is not just strength, but what kind of purpose does this strength serve? Is it to eradicate all the wrongs of the kingdom, or to maintain its corrupt rule? Don't you already have an answer in your heart, Your Highness? And your answer is my answer. Brando replied slowly. He closed his eyes. Others thought that he was talking about the second revival of the kingdom, but Brando was actually talking about the last revival of Erewhon. That was the final scene of the kingdom's drama, but it was a regrettable one. Griffin looked at Brando in a daze and clenched her fists. She had already thought of this answer in her heart. But she closed her eyes and forced herself not to cry because of her emotions. She wanted to maintain the rule of the kingdom. It was not because the royal family of Covardo had to last for generations. It was because she wanted to inherit the ideals of the late king and herself, to recreate the most glorious era in Erewhon's history. But her glory did not belong to the nobles, but to the entire kingdom, everyone. Even if the royal family of Covardo no longer maintained their rule, she would not let the glory of the Holy Church fade away. From then on, Erewhon would shine in Wone's history as a kingdom, and not as a vassal of the nobles. Just like the vow that King Eric made on this land, the Lionheart sword did not mean that the rule of this land would continue forever, but that the glory belonged to the people of Erewhon. Until that moment, this ancient kingdom would become strong from the inside out, and radiate new life and vitality. Brando silently looked at the weak girl. She had never had a companion in history. Other than a few players, no one knew the true ideals of the princess. Even the nobles who supported her did not understand why she insisted on it. In order to gain the support of the royal party, in order to gain the support of Duke Erek, she had to compromise time and time again. Some players even slandered her as a political prostitute, but she had to maintain the rule of the nobles in order to achieve her ultimate goal. But the development of history did not always go as expected, and this was the tragedy of the princess. She had to go against her ideals time and time again. Although she tried her best to make up for it, in the end, it was hard to change it. When she finally decided to give up the past and focus on moving forward, the new nobles that she had promoted and the royal party who supported her immediately abandoned her. Perhaps she should have jumped out of this outdated mindset from the beginning and won the support of the people who should support her. But she was still a princess who grew up in the royal family, and she deeply feared the power of the nobles. But finally, there was someone who stood behind her. Perhaps this is a change, Brendel thought to himself. It made her understand that she could not only rely on the nobles of the kingdom. There were many people who wanted to change this ancient kingdom, such as Freya, Amandina, and even the descendants of nobles like Carglass. It was just that they could not say it out loud, and they could not see through the fog of history. But he could see everything in the future at a glance. He did not even need to guess. History and the future were within his reach. Brando understood what was right, and what was wrong. The nobles in the north were obsessed with the power of the past, and all their efforts were just to continue the current situation. But there were still people who were determined to get rid of the old abuses, and understood that this ancient kingdom must be reborn from the ruins. He looked back and saw Carglass lying on a simple stretcher not far away, winking at him. Amandina nodded at him with a smile, as if she was relieved. Princess Griffin also took a deep breath. She could not help but look over Brando's shoulder, and her silver eyes reflected the scene of Adega rampaging through the Northern Coalition army in the valley. She sighed softly. "Thank you, Mr. Brando. Although the people of Erewhon will inevitably kill each other, after losing half of the Black Blade squad, the nobles in the north will reconsider their position. If the Holy Cathedral of Fire does not want Erewhon to fall into a long civil war, they may turn to us and compromise. The kingdom must go through the pain of rebirth, but it is better than slowly bleeding. Ampere Seal has done it all in one battle. Mr. Brando has single-handedly changed the future of Erewhon, and saved more people of Erewhon from the flames of war. I thank you on behalf of this ancient kingdom." She said this from the bottom of her heart. Ampere Seal's crisis seemed dangerous, but it also contained opportunities. The royal faction, the nobles in the north, and herself were all looking for the key to breaking the situation, but the nobles in the north were the first to act. The Holy Cathedral of Fire's participation was unexpected, and the situation was irreversible. But at this time, Brando single-handedly changed the whole situation. She had seen many people, but the young man in front of her was like an anomaly. He had power and strength, but she could not see the sophistication and cunning that the nobles in the kingdom usually had. Even she herself was unavoidably branded with it. That was why she could treat herself and others as political chips without batting an eyelid. But Brando did not have it. She could understand this in just a short time. She could not understand that kind of free, unrestrained, and determined temperament. Such temperament was ridiculous and childish in the eyes of the nobles, but perhaps it was this kind of person who could change history. Her Royal Highness looked a lot more relaxed. But Brando shook his head, and had to hurt her mood. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid it's not that simple. You think too simply of the Holy Cathedral of Fire." He was not being an alarmist, but he had seen the greed and arrogance of those guys with his own eyes. Erewhon's people had lost their honor, but how could the descendants of the Flame King not be the same? It was just that the Cruz Empire was rich, and Erewhon was in a precarious position. Princess Griffin frowned slightly. "Mr. Brando, you mean the Holy Cathedral of Fire will tear up the Sacred Covenant and intervene in Erewhon's civil war? This is impossible." Indeed, this was something that had not happened in 1,000 years. But today was different. Brando knew that the arrival of the great demonic wave was just around the corner. Many prophecies only mentioned this huge change in words and phrases. The Holy Cathedral of Fire had a long history, and it was impossible for them to be unprepared. In fact, the upcoming Holy War was just one of a series of chain reactions brought about by this change. The reason why the Holy Cathedral of Fire attached so much importance to this holy war was because of this. They would never compromise with a vassal state at this time, not to mention that the fragment of the flaming blade was still with him. Although the flaming blade was not something that he had to get, of course, it was tempting to get the divine artifact, but there was more than one divine artifact in the world, and it was not worth it to lose his life for it. But now he had no choice. Orthless had already told him that the divine artifact was bound to him. Simply put, unless he was killed, the flaming blade would belong to him. It sounded wonderful, but it was actually very dangerous. Brando glanced at the princess and nodded. Her Royal Highness did not know that history was at the most critical moment of change, so it was understandable for her to make a mistake in judgment. Moreover, Erewhon had been under the rule of the Holy Cathedral for centuries, and no one dared to underestimate the Holy Cathedral. Princess Griffin was silent for a moment. She did not know how to resist if the Holy Cathedral intervened. Although there was still the Holy Cathedral of Wind, the Wind Elves of St. Tassel would never intervene as long as Cruz did not try to annex Erewhon. She could not help but bite her lips, and unknowingly, her lower lip was bleeding. But Brando looked up. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and in the valley below, Adago was fighting with the Northern Coalition army. But it was at this time that Brando felt a strange aura in the sky. It was as if a stone had been thrown into a calm lake, causing ripples to appear on the battlefield. Brando, that's the reaction of the portal. Orthless's voice suddenly sounded in his mind. I know. Brando nodded. He was too familiar with it. In the future battlefield of Wond, mass teleportation was one of the most commonly used tactics. When a large-scale portal was opened, it was often the most shocking scene on the battlefield. But this time, the teleportation in the sky made Brando's heart palpitate. That was the Door of Flame. Above the Sea of Ampere Seal, there was a world of water between heaven and earth. A quiet fleet quietly docked in the sky above St. White Bay. The Erewhon Royal Fleet's flagship, Victory, the Royal Navy's officers were lined up in the heavy rain, as if waiting for a review. In the distant sky, a clear cry pierced through the rain, and an Erewhon wyvern flapped its wings and appeared in the rain. It approached the fleet in an instant, and then landed on the deck of the Victory. The wyvern flapped its wings twice, and a person jumped down from its back. Captain! The officers immediately shouted in unison. Very good. The commander of the Erewhon Royal Fleet's First Fleet, Count Yanalasu, looked at his subordinates and replied seriously, Bring me my coat. Captain! Ampere Seal has entered a state of war. Her Royal Highness ordered the First Fleet to prepare to depart. There was a burst of excited cheers on the deck. Count Yanalasu looked up, and the ship was already busy. The magic power core began to rotate, and a few mages in silver robes came to the magic helm at the highest point of Victory. Position, my lord. The helmsman of the Victory, the silver-robed mage, silver-flamed Darwent, asked calmly after confirming that all the procedures were in place. Count Yanalasu looked back at the vast curtain of rain. Anchor coordinates, 128, 22, all fleet in position, status level 1. Activating the secret anchor point at St. White Bay, codename, Battle of St. White. Listen to my orders, prepare to jump. P.S. It was a bit difficult at first, but I forced myself to write it and it became smooth, so it's a bit late today. I'll apologize first, hee, and ask for votes. By the way, I drew a Roman image when I was bored. Let's see how to send it to the starting point later. Everyone can refer to it. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it at the starting point, Chidian. Calm. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 606. A streak of lightning flashed across the dark purple sky, and the clouds were boiling like porridge. Suddenly, a red dot appeared in the middle of the sky. Like a falling stone hitting water, a red circle appeared in the sky and spread out for half a mile. There was a soft buzzing sound. Brando, this is. Orthlus's voice was a little cautious. I know. Brendel's face was expressionless as he watched the scene unfold. The soldiers on the princess' side in the forest finally noticed the change above their heads. They looked up stiffly and saw a huge shadow gradually appearing under the red circle. It was a battleship. The 4 decks of cannons and the towering stern of the battleship gradually turned from a shadow to reality. Beside it, 3 smaller red circles spread out one by one, and then 3 small frigates appeared one by one in the storm. Then, 12 red dots flashed in the sky. Knight in golden red robes holding flame-shaped swords formed a circle around the fleet. It's the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The fleet of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The sudden appearance of an unfamiliar army finally affected the entire battlefield. Even Adega could not help but raise his huge head to look at the uninvited guests who had suddenly appeared in midair. Then, the soldiers of the Northern Coalition Army also put down their weapons and looked up. More red dots flashed in the storm, like red butterflies dancing. Every time the red light flashed, a fully armored knight riding on a silver Pegasus was left behind. After that, an even wider red dot spread across several miles of the sky. After the red light, a vast number of soldier monks appeared in the sky. Each soldier monk had a pair of flaming wings on their back, as if they were golden angels. The battlefield was silent for a moment. The goddess of golden flame at the bow of the ship, 13 sails, 4 decks, 110 cannons. Brando looked at the scene in front of him and could not help but shake his head gently. The Ash-class battleship, the Perrin. The Knights of the Holy Cathedral. The Holy Cathedral of Fire's armed forces, the Scepter of Fire. The 13 green sails spread out into a pile of green clouds in the storm. The giant ship in the sky was slowly turning, and the goddess at the bow of the ship was shining in the storm. It was the goddess of golden flame at the bow of the ship. The 4 battleships turned one by one and aimed at the storm elemental Adega with one side of the ship. Adega had been sleeping for nearly 1,000 years, and it had never seen such a thing before. But it was at this moment that it keenly felt a great danger looming over it. Cruz's orders came in the wind. Wizards in position. Open the cannons. The next moment, the 4 warships shook violently, and one side of their hull suddenly shot out a fierce flame. Oh! Before anyone could react, Adega the Rager let out a blood-curdling scream that shook the heavens and earth. A bright explosion of fireworks suddenly in the night sky. Cruz's people poured all their firepower on the huge monster. Although the more advanced magic power and disintegration crystals of this era had not yet been developed, and the power of the old-fashioned magic cannons designed by the Hazel people was far from enough to pose a real threat to the storm elemental, the severe pain still made Adega of the Rager subconsciously raise its head. It was at that moment. 11 Knights of the Holy Cathedral raised their swords at the same time and stabbed at Adega's throat. 11 golden rays of light extended from the flame-shaped long swords in their hands, completely penetrating Adega in an instant and locking the monster to the ground like 11 golden threads. Compared to the overwhelming firepower of the 4 battleships before, this was a fatal blow to Adega. 11 masters with elemental activation. Even under normal circumstances, it would not dare to take the attack head-on, let alone hit its vitals. Adega suddenly let out a mournful howl. Lightning flashed in his body and he became shockingly bright, as if he was going to collapse at any time. However, this monster was indeed one of the top bosses in the early versions of the Amber Sword. Even though he was severely injured, he didn't die immediately. Instead, his ferocious nature was aroused. He struck back, waving his huge palm in the air. The storm elemental was huge, and this palm almost covered half of the battlefield. The 11th Knight of the Holy Cathedral did not dare to take it head-on and hurriedly scattered. The 3 frigates behind them were in trouble. One of the ships was directly hit by a dagger. Just as the cyan protective shield lit up, it instantly emitted a blazing white light. Then, with a loud bang, it was smashed into pieces by a dagger's slap. It was swept into the distant hills from mid-air. About a few seconds later, a bright fireball rose in that direction. But it was at this time. The thick clouds in the sky suddenly moved slightly. The clouds seemed to gather in a vortex in one direction, and in the center of the vortex, a golden red light flashed. Boom! A fiery red beam of light fell from the sky with a loud bang. Like a red sword, it pierced through the head of Adega the Rager in a flash and nailed it to the ground. The storm in the center of the battlefield suddenly stopped. There seemed to be a faint sigh in the wind and rain. Then, in the blink of an eye, countless lightning spread out from Adega's body and tore its body into pieces. It turned into clouds and dissipated in the storm. Then everyone on the battlefield saw a tall knight in a long cloak in the clouds pulling out his long sword from the lightning. It was the deputy commander of the Holy Cathedral Knight Regiment, the Golden Flame Sword Williams. The Northern Coalition Army suddenly let out a cheer. It was shocking. Williams, the deputy commander of the Holy Cathedral Knight Regiment, calmly looked at the ants on the ground. There was not a trace of superfluous expression on his face, but golden lines of law surrounded his long cloak. His eyes also turned golden. He held the long sword in his hand and looked down. The rain in the sky turned into white smoke before it could get close to his body, and then merged into the surrounding rain. He did not speak. The ground quickly quieted down. After Adega the storm elemental dissipated, there was only a piece of embers left after the explosion. Those small wind elementals also scattered and fled. No one would think of holding them back. William soon saw the little girl in silver in the forest. At that moment, Princess Griffin also saw him. The young girl stood in the rain with her head held high. Her face was pale and her silver eyes reflected a trace of rain. However, there was a light that was even brighter than before, as if there was a ball of raging flames burning within. At that moment, Williams had an illusion, as if he saw the pair of incomparably bright eyes. But he shook his head and laughed self-deprecatingly. "Little princess, I'll give you a chance. If you bring your men out and surrender, I can spare your lives." William said softly, but his voice seemed to spread throughout the battlefield so that every soldier present could hear it clearly. "How can you do this?" Princess Griffin clenched her fists tightly and gritted her teeth. "You made an oath before the sacred covenant. What did that oath say? You said that you would treat every country under the Holy Cathedral fairly, but today, I only see the Holy Cathedral of Fire belonging to Cruz. If one day the Holy Cathedral of Fire betrays everyone, aren't you afraid of being betrayed by everyone?" Brando saw that her hands were trembling slightly. Williams did not speak, and did not even bother to find an excuse. He replied faintly, "Is this your answer, Princess Griffin? Unfortunately, no matter what you say, you can't change the fact that you must belong to the losing side today. Because this is the will of the Holy Cathedral." Princess Griffin suddenly froze as if struck by lightning, her silver eyes full of grief and indignation. Williams glanced at her and shook his head disdainfully. "Princess Griffin, either surrender. Otherwise, I'll let them die with you. You only have half a minute to think about it." Her voice shook the mountains and fields. Greysword Saint Mephistopheles carried his long sword and suddenly stopped. He looked up and saw a golden red door suddenly open not far in front of him. An old man in a bishop's robe stepped out of it. Then 9 more light doors opened beside him, and 9 knights of the holy cathedral came out of them one by one. A circle of people surrounded him directly. Mephistopheles was a little amused. I just killed a bishop, and here comes another one. The high-ranking priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire are more numerous than dogs. This obvious sarcasm did not annoy Wood. Instead, the old man smiled slightly. You don't have to show off your glorious deeds of killing Moros to me. But you are hurrying so slowly. Aren't you afraid that the little guy will be killed by Williams? Mephistopheles glanced at him angrily. If I say that I am worried, will you make way? Sorry, that won't happen. Then that's it. The two suddenly stopped, looked at each other, and then smiled at the same time. When we were in Cruz, thank you for letting me live, but I am not what I used to be. It is not impossible to kill you, Wood, the Ash Sword Saint suddenly said. So, you are really going to do it? Wood asked. Not to that extent. You have your dreams to realize, and I have my homeland to recover. As long as you don't stand in front of me, I won't do anything to you. What's more, you know this. Otherwise, why would you bring so many people to kill me? Mephistopheles glanced at the knight of the Holy Cathedral and said as if he did not care, besides, it is a bit difficult to deal with you alone. It will be a bit troublesome if there are so many dogs. The knight of the Holy Cathedral heard this and glared at him, but no one dared to do anything. It was not known whether it was because of the order or because they were afraid of his strength. So, it is better to stop and look at the scenery. Then you go your way, and I go mine. It is not a day or two that you can't catch me. I don't think the Holy Cathedral will bother you because of this. Mephistopheles sneered. They have already lost one bishop, and they don't want to lose a second one. Wood shook his head and looked in the direction of the sea cliff. In the distance, the sea was surging with dark clouds. In the storm, the waves formed a white line and smashed into countless waves on the reef. Although I don't know what your relationship with him is, it seems that you are really not worried about that little guy. No, I didn't believe it at first, but now that you are here, I believe it. Mephistopheles shook his head and replied with a smile, I am here, and his purpose has been achieved. Do you understand? Oh. Wood was slightly startled. He already knew that I was behind this. Could it be that Tumen is also an Ampere seal, and he told him? No, the Ash Sword Saint laughed happily. He just guessed from the beginning that the Holy Cathedral of Fire was involved in this. It was not because of you, but because of Moros. Wood frowned and looked at this guy suspiciously. Due to some special reasons, he had once let the other party off in curluts, but he also understood that the other party would never appreciate it. The other party was smiling so happily. It must be because the Holy Cathedral of Fire had suffered a loss somewhere. Moros killed Princess Magadol. He thought that he could hide it from everyone, but there is always a mistake. He must have never dreamed that his identity would be guessed. Mephistopheles smiled and said word by word. That young man is really sharp. Wood's eyebrows raised, and his face suddenly changed. Time's up, Your Highness, what is your answer? There was silence on the battlefield, as if after the sound of fighting had receded, only the sound of the rain was left. But after a moment, William's voice sounded again. Arrogant and contemptuous. Brando saw Princess Griffin standing in the rain in a daze. He was about to walk over, but he did not expect the princess to turn around first. In the pouring rain, the half-elf girl's silver eyes were filled with determination. Mr. Brando, I have decided to surrender to the nobles of the north. Brendel could not believe his ears. He stared at the princess with his mouth agape. But Princess Griffin said softly, after I die, there is still one person in Erewhon who can pick up this dream. I believe that person, I believe that he did not lie to me. She raised her head and looked at everyone in the forest. If these people survive today, one day, they will be the seeds of Erewhon's future. Your Highness. Mr. Brando, I only have one request. She looked at Brando, and her eyes were amazingly bright. Please save my brother, because even if he can't be king one day, I at least hope that he can live well. This is my only wish, Mr. Brando. She took out a crystal and put it in Brando's hand. This is the anchor key. Only it can provide an anchor point for the royal fleet. Father built this fleet with his own hands, and he gave it to me personally. Now I entrust it to you. Princess Griffin suddenly smiled, and tears slid down her cheeks. Mr. Brando, I hope you remember that there was once a princess of Erewhon who fought side by side with you. I hope the kingdom will last forever. I hope that one day our dream can really be realized. I really hope that your sword will always shine, Erewhon. Brando stared blankly at the princess who was crying in front of him. This was the second time he had seen her cry. She was no longer the strong image in history, but she was the real princess of Erewhon. He covered her mouth with his hand. There was no need to say anything. At that moment, time seemed to freeze. Brando pulled out his sword and stepped past the stunned princess. He had already raised his head and replied softly, "There is no need to say anything, Your Highness. Please have hope. Don't give up your dream. Because today, history will not repeat itself. The future of this kingdom, I will personally change it for you to see. And from this moment on, everything in the past has already disappeared. There will no longer be the crying of Butchie, and no more crimson sorrow. Here, the kingdom has not deviated from the path of glory, and everything can still be salvaged." Not far from him, the female knight Maynard who heard his words raised her head as if she had been electrocuted. But Brando had already raised the Halran Gaia in his hand and pointed at the person in the air. "Williams," Brendel yelled, 40 years later, the accounts. "Today, I represent those people from that day, to ask you to pay it back. Are you ready?" The forest was silent, and the entire battlefield seemed to be left with only the silhouette of a single person. And in front of him was the huge fleet of crews. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 607. Williams. The total account after 40 years. Today, on behalf of those people, I am here to ask you to pay it back. The young man's voice echoed throughout the battlefield. Other than his voice, the battlefield was silent. He stood on top of the forest, facing everyone, as if there was another world in front of him. The army of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was still there. But that moment was destined to be forever frozen in everyone's memory. Time flew by, and after they grew old, whether it was enemies or allies, there would be a day when they would remember everything that happened at this moment. It was a door of memory that had been opened, and behind it, time flowed like a river. Although it was quiet, it had the power to see through people's hearts. The veterans present finally remembered that a few centuries ago, their ancestors had also defeated the same enemy fair and square. Because Erewhon had not only lost his honor, but also his courage. But today, there was finally someone who stood in this position again. He picked up his sword, and there was a faint shadow of another person on him. That person stood on top of the holy white rock, with a smile in his eyes, looking at the kingdom. His vision was so deep, as if it was an arc in the sky. In Princess Griffin's eyes, history strangely overlapped, and the burnt yellow line seemed to outline an old picture. But the glorious impression in the picture was fading, and finally, only the back of the young man in front of her was left. The sound of the battlefield seemed to have been sucked out. Reckless. Williams's eyes darkened slightly. He raised the flame-shaped sword in his hand and was about to say attack, but before he could open his mouth, a violent swirl of air rushed towards him. Williams grabbed the swirl of air with his left hand and tore it into pieces, and immediately realized that it was just an ordinary wind bullet. How dare he attack him with something as insignificant as a wind bullet? His heart was filled with cold murderous intent, but at this time, he had already heard Brando order first, attack. Williams was finally enraged. Brando was simply looking down on the dignity of the Holy Cathedral. Even the craziest of cultists would not dare to do such a frivolous act. The authority of the Holy Cathedral was maintained by its majesty above the mortal world. As the deputy commander of the Holy Cathedral Knight Regiment, he would not allow these scoundrels of Erewhon to shake the foundation of the Holy Cathedral. Kill all these heretics. Leave none alive. He coldly gave the order. A great battle was about to break out. The army in the sky immediately spread out. When the divine temple's soldiers with flaming wings glided down, it was as if a meteor shower had fallen from the dark clouds, or as if molten steel had been poured down from the sky. It was all crimson. The 11 Templar Knight also charged towards the Anchor Mountain. 11 powerhouses in the elemental activation realm. This was a force that even Erewhon's entire country could not resist. Each of these proud knights had reason to believe that as long as they took action, victory would be as easy as crushing dry weeds and smashing rotten wood. However, a flag that seemed to be burning with golden flames suddenly appeared in their vision. The golden battle flag entered the battlefield. A dazzling radiance shrouded the entire valley in an instant. Amidst the radiance, Vampire Princess Andrea's dress seemed to have ignited with a layer of abyssal flames. After the flames subsided, a shiny, pitch-black armor appeared on her dress. Everyone around her saw that the Vampire Princess suddenly turned into a blood-like liquid when the Holy Cathedral Knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire moved, and then slowly seeped into the ground. But in the next moment, a drop of blood appeared in mid-air and turned into a ball of blood in an instant. Enrich stepped out of the ball of blood and was already in front of the Holy Cathedral Knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Her eyes were green and red, and the flame of the soul was burning fiercely. The blood in her hand was cast into the air, and the scarlet blood droplets formed a huge crimson moon in the rain. The crimson moon moved forward, and the first Holy Cathedral Knight to block its path was immediately unlucky. It was a secondary flame elemental knight, and his elemental element was related to purification. He subconsciously wrapped his hand in a ball of white flame to block Enrich's crimson moon. But in the next moment, he let out a terrible scream. His law of purification immediately counteracted the soul damage of the crimson moon, which was also an element unique to most undead creatures. But Enrich not only had the soul elemental element, she was also a rare dual elemental user. Almost in an instant, her other elemental blood immediately sucked the flesh and blood out of the knight's arm. This is impossible. The Holy Cathedral Knight hurriedly withdrew his hand as if he had been electrocuted. Although it was only a moment of contact, when he raised his hand, his left hand was already white and ghastly. The rest of the Holy Cathedral Knight were shocked. They originally thought that Enrich was just an elemental awakener, and had underestimated her. But now they all reacted. The difference between a dual elemental user and a single elemental user was not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. The combat power it brought was also multiplied. Elemental awakeners were naturally stronger than elemental awakeners, but it did not mean that there was an absolute suppression in combat power. Absolute power was absolute power, and combat power was combat power. These were two different things. Just like how Brando could often rely on the Planeswalker system to challenge people of a higher level. But just as they dispersed, a silver-white figure entered their field of vision. If it was possible, at that moment, all the Holy Cathedral Knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would have immediately cried out in their hearts, F***CK. The silver fairy princess who appeared in front of them was riding a holy white single-horned dragon. The spear in her hand was more like a sharp sword. She was wearing a pure white robe, and underneath, a shimmering chain mail could be seen. The Silver Elf Dragon King Cavalry. The single-horned dragon that Metasha was riding was said to be a descendant of the silver dragon king, Rodion. It was said that its bloodline was the closest to the pure-blooded dragons. It was a silver species and had extremely high intelligence. They lived together with the silver elves and were one of the silver elves' closest companions. The spear in her hand had even more origins. According to the ancient elven language, the name of this spear should be Wiro, which meant immortal. Legend said that this spear was an imitation of the spear that the Azure Knight pierced through the dome. There were only 130 spears, no more, no less. Therefore, the Silver Elf Dragon King cavalry was only 130 at the beginning. That was the top army of the 14th grade. For a moment, the 11 Holy Cathedral Knight almost wanted to turn around and leave. The Silver Elf Dragon King cavalry had always been just a legend. In ancient times, they had participated in the final war with the Twilight Dragon. Although they were cannon fodder. But that was a legendary era in itself. Later on, this mythical army had even been absent from the war against the Darkness Dragon. But today, she appeared in front of them again, making people suspect that the Twilight Dragon had returned to the world. But fortunately, someone finally reacted and shouted, "Don't worry, she's just a heroic spirit. She only has the strength of an elemental awakening." But even an elemental awakening was unsettling. The key was that there seemed to be many elemental-level powerhouses among the enemy. After all, it was impossible for an elemental ranker to be unknown anywhere, and the key was that in their impression, there were no such people in Aween. In a breath's time. The Shire and Ropar also appeared on the battlefield. The Shire was now wearing a silver robe. He looked more like an artisan wizard of Buga than a highland wizard. He had also matured a lot. He held a thick giant book in his hand, letting people know his profession at a glance. A scroll wizard of Buga. But what surprised Brando was that the Shire's elemental level was actually time. This was also one of the top elemental levels, and it complemented his space. This guy's face was also unusually good. Ropar's change was the smallest among them. This lizard man lord only had a few more battle tattoos on his body, and his elemental level was naturally related to fire. As soon as the four appeared, Brando immediately ordered in his mind, "Delay these Holy Cathedral Knight and buy me some time." At the same time, the 11 Holy Cathedral Knight also understood that it was impossible for them to break through the enemy's defense line immediately. Although Andrique, Metasha, the Shire, and the Fireclaw Lizard Man Lord Ropar were only elemental awakening, the difference between elemental awakening and elemental activation was less than one level, and the key was that the abilities these guys had mastered were frighteningly strange. Needless to say, there was a dual elemental level, and a Silver Elf Dragon King Knight. The Silver Elves were originally a fighting race, and the Dragon King Knight was a troop class that only existed in legends. Although it seemed that their strength had been greatly reduced after becoming heroic spirits, as long as their combat skills were still retained, no one dared to underestimate them. On the other hand, the Scroll Wizards of Buga were also a difficult opponent. These Scroll Wizards were all experienced librarians, but they were not scholars hired by the Noble's Library. They managed the magic books of the Buga Wizards, and each Scroll Wizard's mind was filled with all kinds of knowledge and some rare spells that had never been heard of in the world. It was just that these Scroll Wizards were addicted to the world of words and rarely appeared anywhere outside of the library. God knows why they were involved in this war. The last remaining Lord of the Fireclaw Lizard Man seemed to be the easiest to deal with, but it was also recognized that no elemental creatures or semi-elemental creatures in the elemental realm were easy to deal with. Seeing these people, not only the Holy Cathedral Knight below, but even Williams, who was watching the battle from the top, frowned for a moment. The Shire's appearance made him feel a little uneasy. If the Silver Folk also intervened in this war, it was likely to drag the Holy Cathedral into a protracted diplomatic dispute. But the Buga Wizards should not be so reckless. He could only hope that the Shire's appearance was just a personal act. Williams pressed the hilt of his sword and calmed down again. Although there were some variables, the balance of the battlefield was still far from his side. Since the princess's side did not know what was good for them, he did not mind teaching them a lesson with facts. Exactly. Brando ordered his summoned creatures to temporarily block the top power of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but this was not enough to change the overall situation on the battlefield. In coordination with the attack of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Northern Coalition Army also sounded the horn. After overcoming various difficulties, the black mass of the army began to regroup and advance again. It was just that the soldiers were not so enthusiastic. Erwin's people finally understood that they were not willing to fight side by side with the Crew's people and kill their own people. The nobles had to curse and drive their soldiers forward, so there was a spectacle on the battlefield. The noble lords and the knight beside them had to form rows of supervisors to monitor their army's advance. It was just like the scene of the Crew's people driving their slave army. But even so, the pressure of the army was still suffocating. The nobles' private soldiers under Audine did not know what was going on. They looked at the golden meteors in the sky, shooting straight in the direction of Anchor Mountain. And the army on the ground was advancing like a black cloud. It was a scene of doomsday. If they had the confidence to fight against the Northern Coalition army before, they were now at a loss. Could this battle still be fought? Opposite them was the alliance of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Northern Coalition army. No matter which side it was, they seemed to be somewhat unbeatable, let alone working together. Count Audine tried to reinvigorate the morale of his men, but the results were limited. The Count could not help but sigh. At this time, the Northern Coalition army had already crossed the stream that had begun to surge in the storm and was ready to enter the forest. Everyone could not help but feel a little desperate for a moment. "Mr. Brando," Princess Griffin asked softly, "should we retreat a little?" Brando withdrew his gaze from the sky and looked up at the main battlefield. There were so many enemies that it could be described as a vast ocean. But he shook his head. "Give me a little more time." He was waiting for an opportunity. But it was at this moment that a humming sound suddenly sounded on the battlefield. It was a horn, but it was not the horn of the Northern Coalition army. It was a deeper horn sound. Another new enemy. Or reinforcements. Everyone could not help but be slightly startled and then looked up. Then they saw that in the endless rain, there was a sudden commotion in the southern formation of the Northern Coalition army. This commotion was rapidly spreading, and almost in an instant, a huge gap appeared there. Reinforcements. Everyone's heart skipped a beat. But where would the reinforcements come from? Could it be that the princess's army had arrived? Impossible, everyone shook their heads and their hearts. Even the first royal fleet had not entered the battlefield. How could the princess's army have arrived first? "It's Anthony's army." Count Audine suddenly put down the monocular in his hand and shouted with a trembling voice. "It's the royal faction." There was an immediate uproar among the Knight Academy students. "This is impossible. Didn't they leave already?" But it was indeed the royal faction's army. Anthony's coat of arms, Makarov's private flag, the Violet Earl's private flag, one by one on the battlefield, cutting into the main position of the Northern Coalition army like a sharp blade. Princess Griffin bit her lip and clenched her fists. They're back again. But how could it be? No one knew those people better than her. A group of black and red cavalry appeared on the battlefield. The cavalry cut into the battlefield from the side of Anchor Mountain and killed their way into the formation of the Northern Coalition army that was advancing. They stopped the huge army of the Northern Coalition army right in front of the princess's main position. Then, a knight took the lead and rushed out of the formation. The knight stopped in the rain and turned around on horseback. Then, he lifted his mask. A young face was revealed. It was Eek. The young man raised his sword at Brando and shouted, "Noble Sir Knight. I've come as promised." That day in the Eversong forest, I heard you talk about the dream of the night, the oath to pursue the late king, so I've come today. For Erwin. His voice resounded throughout the battlefield. Brando did not expect Eek to appear at this time and in this situation. He could not help but smile in his heart. He could totally imagine what Eek had done. That cunning fox Makarov must be furious right now. But he turned around and glanced at the princess. It was only at this moment that his heart suddenly calmed down. It turned out that he was not fighting alone here. It was not just him and the princess. There were many people fighting side by side with him. Just like in the game, when he closed his eyes, he was surrounded by like-minded comrades. But this time, they were more capable of controlling their own destiny. So, what was there to be dissatisfied about? He smiled slightly and at the same time, drew the card that he had prepared for a long time from the deck. In the sky, Williams finally frowned. The appearance of Anthony's army was beyond his expectations. In fact, Erwin's Northern Coalition army had promised him that there would never be a third party on the battlefield. These damn bastards. He could not help but curse. But fortunately, it was just a private army of the Northern Coalition army. It was not a big deal. But it would be troublesome if they scattered the Northern Coalition army. He immediately raised the flame-shaped long sword in his hand and ordered the cruise air fleet on the side to stop Anthony's army on the ground. The cruise's flagship, Perrin, immediately began to readjust the direction of the hole. The black hole of the cannon was aimed at the flank of the Northern Coalition army, in the direction where Anthony's army appeared. But the wizards on the 3 warships did not have time to test the landing point of the magic cannon's first shot. Suddenly, there was a fish scale-like fluctuation in the space in front of the fleet. The space was in chaos. The chief wizard on the frigate Taylor screamed, "The portal is reacting, it's a new enemy. Fire! Fire!" The 3 Kurlutzian warships fired subconsciously, and a bright fire suddenly exploded in the rain. But it was still a little late. For green halos suddenly opened in the transparent space, and the shadows of 4 black square towers slowly emerged behind them. Floating space towers. Tower wizards. It's the tower wizards, why are they here? P.S. It took some time to check something. Sorry, 5,000 words to make up for it. I'll consider it when the time is right. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheedian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 608. The Black Tower in the Highlands, the Scholars in the Wilderness, and the Melodious Wind Songs. This was the impression the world had of Karsuk. The Black Tower mages originated from the Silver Folk. When the first generation of Grey Robes mages began to build the Black Tower in the north of Dardanelle, Erwin had yet to be built. To this day, there were still the ruins of the famous Black Tower near Silverhorse City. However, the mages had gradually moved to the north, to the Nail and Charn regions to build huge libraries and cities. The Black Tower mages were closely related to Dai Lingia's Highland Knight, and both sides abided by an ancient treaty. The text was written in a document made of black goat skin, and it was still kept in the Great Library of Charn. When William saw the appearance of these disruptors, his face was gloomy. He raised his head and saw that there were several gold-ranked grey-robed mages at the top of each of the 4 square towers. For the mages of these towers, the black towers that they had painstakingly built were complete magic circles. On their respective towers, their spells could be enhanced to the maximum extent. They were not inferior to elemental masters. Tower mages, how dare you violate the Toftaka Pact? However, the Grey Wizard did not care about him at all. The moment the Black Tower appeared, the sound of magic chanting could be heard in the heavy rain. Lord of Calamity of the Azure, please grant me the authority of the elements, Deep Ice Spear, a slanted white light circle appeared on top of each of the 4 towers. The runes and spells on it rotated and converged at one point, then shot out a blue translucent light belt towards the Holy Cathedral of Fire's fleet. The 3 floating battleships of the Holy Cathedral of Fire immediately sounded like a shrill alarm, and the commanders screamed. The Perrin and Taylor immediately began to maneuver and evade against common sense. The magic core of the floating magic ship let out a sizzling sound, and the outer shell burst out with blue electric arcs one after another. Williams clenched his teeth and swung his sword in that direction. The golden-red sword light was like a flaming whip in the night sky, lashing out at least 1,000 feet away. But it was actually an irregular derivative line of the law. The hot golden line that was moving forward in a zigzag line instantly cut off 3 of the blue light ribbons, and the remaining one still brushed past the bottom keel of the Taylor frigate. With a crisp crash, the mithril frigate was immediately covered in a layer of solid ice that was as thick as an arm. Rainwater flowed down the solid ice and instantly froze into long icicles. The huge weight caused the USS Taylor to sink slightly. Williams disappeared from the sky and appeared in front of the 4 square towers in the next instant. This was not teleportation. Instead, his movements were too fast for the naked eye to catch. Wizards of the Tower, you better give me an explanation. The crew's people are really arrogant. We have long since severed all ties with the Silver Alliance, so please call us Adepts of the Black Tower, Sir Williams. Williams looked coldly at the wizards on the tower. As for why we are here, this is Erewhon's civil war. We chose to support the Corvado royal family. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with you crew's people. Princess Griffin could not help but gently press her chest when she heard this from the forest below. Her slender fingers clenched into a fist. But of course, she knew that these wizards who stood aloof from worldly affairs would not support her for no reason. The only one who was related to them was the former genius of the Peloche family, the Shire. And the descendants of the Earth Sword Saint, Darius, who were related to him. She looked at Brando. The Corvado royal family is involved with the pagans. In the eyes of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, they are not qualified to inherit the throne. Wizards of the Tower, the holy war is imminent. I advise you not to get involved in this dispute. Williams raised his hand, and the entire battlefield suddenly stopped. The soldiers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the 200 Pegasus Knights suddenly stood still in midair. The Northern Allied army also retreated like the tide, distancing themselves from the Knights of Anthony. The Wizards of the Tower were a huge problem. He really did not want to involve them in this whirlpool that was getting bigger and bigger. What a joke. An angry rebuke. Brendel's hand was still holding on to the golden card, but he suddenly stopped. He looked up and coldly interrupted Williams. The Corvado royal family is involved with the pagans. Just based on your words alone. Williams was interrupted by Brando. His face turned green, and he replied coldly, naturally, I can represent the Holy Cathedral here. I don't care to explain to a sinner like you. You just need to know that the Holy Cathedral will never make mistakes. Brando smiled contemptuously. To be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that the Holy Cathedral's words had too much power and he wanted to clear the princess' name, he wouldn't even bother to look at the other party's face. In his opinion, the historical Williams was a complete brainless child. It's up to you to decide whether it's right or wrong. Naturally, there will never be a mistake. Unfortunately, Saint Tassel, Fanzin, and even Eloranta won't agree with your bullshit. The Holy Cathedral will never make a mistake. Is the history of the Bishop of Russ's region bribing all for one during the year of separation a myth? What Bishop of Russ's region? William's expression changed slightly, and his hand was pressed on the hilt of his sword. The Bishop of Russ's region, Canfuck, was close to the people and was once a strong candidate for the central priest. Later, he disappeared inexplicably. The Holy Cathedral announced that he died of illness. It's ridiculous that a priest can die of illness. Could it be that dispelling illness is a divine spell that you worked hard to develop after the year of separation? Why do I remember that it was a spell that existed as early as the year of the saints? William's face showed signs of turning from green to black, but Brando did not intend to let him go. To be honest, the Holy Cathedral of Fire was a huge organization, and there were countless regional archbishops. Border areas like Erewhon had long been infiltrated like a sieve. Amon, whom he met in the loop of trade winds, was not the first all-for-one spy, and would not be the last. The funny thing is that the dignified Holy Cathedral of Fire is so stifled even when it comes to finding an excuse. Perhaps the organization is too rigid and bureaucratic, but fortunately, your authority is indeed deeply rooted in the people's hearts, and no one will pursue such a bizarre reason. But you don't really think that all the countries on the continent except for Cruz are fools, do you? Brando's words seemed to have frozen the battlefield. His words were definitely treacherous in the past, and for thousands of years, the civilians under the rule of the four holy cathedrals had never thought of questioning the authority of the Supreme. But this was like a piece of window paper. As long as it was poked through, it was enough to raise doubts in the hearts of most people. Besides, it was not that the nobles did not suspect that there was something fishy behind this, but they were well aware of it. Brando continued, "Besides, do you really think that no one knows all the secrets here? Don't forget that there are too many pairs of eyes in this world. Wizards record history, astrologers predict the future, and only you think that you can hide from the world." Although the religious events in the Rus area have been dusty for nearly 3 centuries, there are many documents in Buga and White City. Even under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, there are still many descendants of those who know about it in Jacka and Eredeb. You think I'm lying? Then let me tell you, the First Era, 101, in West Chiefran, enough. Williams looked at Brando as if he had seen a ghost. What Brando said was the most strictly guarded secret of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In fact, the upper echelons of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were aware of the infiltration from below, but it could not be helped. They could not make everything public because authority was everything to the Holy Cathedral. But the question was, how did he know? When Brando said the First Era, 101, Williams felt as if he had been stabbed in the chest by a sword, which happened to be the most critical point of the religious case. He did not know how Brando knew these details, but he was sure that if this was a nightmare, then Brando must be the biggest nightmare in front of him right now. With such a serious leak, even if he was implicated, he would end up in big trouble in the end. Although he was the deputy commander of the Holy Cathedral of Knights, do not forget that although the Holy Cathedral of Knights only had one commander, there were 7 deputy commanders. This is the difference between a sage and a mortal. The people's hearts are in turmoil, and being bought by the cultists can only mean that he has fallen into depravity. What does it have to do with the Holy Cathedral? The fact that the Holy Cathedral is dealing with such scum shows that the inside is still pure. William suppressed the uneasiness in his heart and answered seriously. You have a glib tongue, Sir Williams. If this is an individual case, then it is true. But as far as I know, the Holy Cathedral's performance in the periphery is not as good as you say. For example, Brando replied aggressively. Cut the crap. Williams did not dare to let him speak again. If he continued, he, as the deputy commander, would really be taken to court. It's the same for you, descendant of the Cataloso family. 60 years ago, the Holy Cathedral made a huge mistake. But they will not repeat the same mistake. He turned his head and looked coldly at the Black Tower wizards in the sky. You should all remember what happened in the Valley of Fefapi. If you do not want to be involved in this huge trouble, immediately turn around and leave. I can pretend that you were never here today. Valley of Fefapi. Brando was slightly stunned. He seemed to have heard of this name before. He immediately memorized the name in his heart and prepared to look it up in Charn's library when he had time. Or it would be best to go to Buga's silver wall, to look up the history on the wall. However, it seemed that the Holy Cathedral of Fire was indeed very afraid of the Black Tower wizards. It was a pity that the royal family of Covardo did not catch them back then. Now it seemed that the Highland wizards did not have any ill feelings towards Princess Griffin. Why did they later become so disloyal? Williams thought that he could scare off these troublemakers who suddenly appeared, but he did not expect a group of people to walk out from behind the grey-robed wizard. When he saw these knights in sky-blue armor, he knew that things were not good. He saw that the leader of the knights was Bunide, the commander of the Highland Knights. This handsome middle-aged man smiled and replied, "Williams, it seems that your memory is deteriorating very quickly. There are signs of prematurely aging. How did I answer you last time? The decision of the Highland Knights half a century ago is our decision now. When have the Highland Knights ever broken their oath? If you want to fight, I will accompany you. The Holy Cathedral of Fire is powerful, but the blood of the Danilas has not run dry." Bunide pulled out his long sword and winked at Brando, who was in the forest below. "Descendant of Darius, I heard that you are resourceful. I believe that you will not fight a decisive battle with these northern barbarians here if you do not have full confidence. So, I will help you block these broken ships of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. I hope you can teach these arrogant cruise people a lesson." Brando raised his head and smiled in his heart. The sudden appearance of Eco and the Highland Knight warmed his heart. The Erewhon people were not completely dead, at least some of them still had the blood of ancient pride flowing in their bodies. Of course. But these are probably the vanguard fleet of the cruise people. "Uncle, you have to be careful," he replied. "Uncle?" Bunide laughed out loud. "Thank you for your concern." These two people acted as if there was no one else around. The anger in William's heart could simply destroy the Erewhon people. "Since you don't appreciate my good intentions and are determined to walk this path to the end, then there is no need for us to talk anymore." He knew that if he did not kill Brando today based on his previous words, he would probably be sent to the Inquisition tomorrow. He took one last look at the Danel Highland Knight and did not say another word. The negotiations broke down and the attack continued. The Northern Coalition army was regrouping. In fact, Anthony's army also needed time to adjust. But the battle was about to break out. Brando lowered his head and shouted to Eco, who was not far away, "Eco, can you stop the northern barbarians? It's a little troublesome." Eco waved his sword. "I didn't expect there to be so many of them." Brando almost fainted. "You didn't expect so many enemies and you still came. What kind of commander is this?" He suddenly saw Makarov not far away, whose face was as black as the bottom of a pot. He suddenly understood how he felt. But Eco just smiled faintly and said, "But it doesn't matter. The knight is only seeking death for the sake of his ideals." Brando shook his head. This guy is really crazy. But he did not want to die here with this dumb knight. The situation below had to be stabilized first before he had time to deal with the Sanctum Knight above. He finally threw the card forward and said, "It doesn't matter. In that case, let me help you." How do you help?" Brando did not need to answer. Because the grimoire of life was entering the field. A ball of pure white light was rising from the Anchor Mountains. It was like the first light in the darkness, giving life and spirit, described in the epic of the crew's creation. Suddenly, a huge book emitting the purest power of life appeared in front of Brando. At that moment, he abandoned the Sea Wave gem and used the Sea Wave gem's feature of sacrificing this card. Choose any card in your hand, and make it enter the field for free, to put in the 25-cost grimoire of life without any cost. Life, Martha's domain. The majestic power swept through the entire battlefield in an instant. Everyone subconsciously turned to look at the direction of the white light, their hearts throbbing. Another divine artifact. Williams felt the flaming blade shards on his body vibrating slightly. This was the resonance between the divine artifacts. But the power of the divine artifact was far greater than that of Flaming Blade Odorfice, because he could deeply feel the reverence of the Flaming Blade shards. He raised his head just in time to see Brando's second spell. A white halo spread out from the young man's hand. Isn't this guy a swordsman? Williams thought. In fact, Brando was showing the mana cost of the Eternal Orb. The ability of the Eternal Orb was to tap and pay 5 mana to choose the next card to enter the field and provide a perfect copy. Brando paid 5 mana and copied the Grimoire of Life. When the 2 Grimoires of Life appeared in the sky above the battlefield, everyone's mind went blank. The twin holy artifacts. Williams immediately had a bad feeling, although Brando hadn't launched an attack yet. But he also roughly guessed the other's profession. He clearly noticed that the 2 books of divine artifacts were summoned into the battlefield by Brando. Although he didn't know what Brando wanted to do, even the prerequisite summon was a divine artifact. How bad could the follow-up be? For the first time, the deputy leader of the Knights Templar felt that the battlefield was out of his expectations. He never dreamed that a young man who was just elemental awakening would have such a backup plan. A young sword saint who was less than 20 years old and had elemental awakening, his real profession was actually a summoner. Was there any justice in this? Who would believe him if he said that? At that moment, Brando just happened to look up. At that moment, he was looking at Williams as a planeswalker, and for the first time, the vice-captain of the Knights Templar felt a deep sense of fear. He saw in that pair of young eyes the aura of a sovereign looking down on everything. It seemed to be saying, "Are you ready? Stop him." The fear in William's heart rose. He raised his long sword high and slashed down with the strongest strength in his life. That sword was like a ray of light in the sky. A golden red line, parting the curtain of rain. The lines of the law surrounded the blade, like the hand of God smoothing out the darkness. With one slash, almost half of the sky was shining with the power of the law. At that moment, William's heart seemed to touch the boundary between life and death. A spiral peak suddenly appeared above his head, and the law spread out in all directions like a line. Then he saw the extreme plains. It was pure white. The Black Tower wizards immediately noticed the abnormality of this sword. Bun-eyed was the same. Although they couldn't understand the understanding of the ultimate power after igniting the fire seed of the blossom element. However, Bun-eyed felt a deep shudder in the air. Williams had actually advanced at this juncture. Was this scientific? Master Ashwood. Teleport over there. He wants to kill Brando. He suddenly grabbed the tower of the Black Tower and shouted to the tower on the left. The Grey Robe Wizard only hesitated for a moment, and suddenly clapped his hands. The Black Tower suddenly disappeared, and then in the next moment, it appeared in the path of William's golden sword. With a sizzling sound, like a hot knife cutting into butter, a golden flame slashed across the center of the giant tower. In an instant, the supposedly indestructible Black Tower collapsed. The Grey Robe Wizards on top of it immediately scattered and flew to the other giant towers. And William's golden sword flame was still moving forward, and it was not even blocked at all. Ah, the extreme realm. Bun-eyed finally realized what happened, and the second half of his sentence was stuck in his throat. William suddenly opened his eyes. His eyes were calm, and he gently exhaled. Unfortunately, it was still a little short. But this attack was indeed at the level of the extreme realm. He quietly looked at the line of golden law and the curtain of rain that was sweeping across half of the sky, approaching the treetop, and was about to hit Brando directly. This was the power of the extreme realm. But it was at this moment. Countless pure white light shields suddenly appeared in front of Brando, and each shield blocked in front of William's golden law. Each shield deflected the most powerful attack of the vice-commander of the Holy Cathedral Knights Order, as if a gentle hand was smoothing these hot golden lines one by one. In an instant, the golden flame that covered half of the sky was swallowed by darkness. It did not even hurt Brando at all. Brando still looked up at Williams, and used his mouth to answer the endless questions in the eyes of the Holy Cathedral's high-ranking member, Enroldo's Holy Ring, 10 points. Enroldo's Holy Ring, Paradise of Adversity X, 10 points, spell, instant, effect, the next attack will be ineffective. Sanctuary, Williams' hand was completely frozen in the air. Almost everyone on the battlefield was stunned. P.S. Oh, it's finally starting. Sob sob, I've been writing for so long. It feels like a century. Everyone, please give me some monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chitian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 609. It was a magnificent strike supported by the power of the ultimate realm. The golden flames that filled the sky seemed to have brought the scorching heat of the elemental world to the battlefield. In the entire Kurlutz Empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire, there were no more than 10 people who had reached the ultimate realm. Each one of them had their own unique experiences to the ordinary people present. Just like the Earth Sword Saint Darius back in the day, no one dared to say that they could withstand his strike. Even the cross-hand Bugge of today did not have the confidence to do so. But such a strike was like a stone sinking into the sea in front of Brando. Countless golden lines of law that cut through the curtain of rain collided with the pure white curtain of light that appeared. Because it was too fast for the human eye to react, the crowd could only see the flames rolling back like fireworks, like a big golden Persian chrysanthemum blooming in the torrential rain. Then, the flames disappeared without a trace. The lines of law that represented the sublimation of flames were reversed. This could only mean one thing in the world of Wond. It meant that the authority of the law was too low and was rejected by a higher priority. But that was the law of the ultimate realm of the fire element. Could it be the power of existence? While everyone was stunned, only Brando understood that among all the rules that he had seen, the world of Wond, where the planeswalkers formed their own system, seemed to have the highest priority. The description on the card of fate was that no matter how bizarre it was, the world of Wond would immediately agree. The description on Enrolda's Holy Ring said that the first attack was ineffective, so no matter how powerful the next attack was, even if it could destroy the world, as long as Brando showed this card, he would be fine. This was the strongest shield. Even he himself was amazed by such a rule, let alone others. But Brendel did not stop. He took advantage of the moment when Williams was distracted by the battle. He took the opportunity to place the 4 nightmare forges on the battlefield. The nightmare forges crawled out from the ground like shiny metal beetles, about the size of a human head. These creatures were only silver, level 35, after the evolution of the golden battle flag, and did not attract much attention at first, but their ability to complete self-replication by devouring light elements. White light constantly flew out from Brando's hand and merged into the nightmare forges inside the ugly nightmare forges. Soon, the number of nightmare forges on the battlefield increased to 32. Brando's elemental pool now had 78 fire elemental, 51 wind elemental, 55 earth elemental, 48 water elemental, 50 light elemental, and 60 dark elemental. Among them, the growth of the fire elemental was far ahead due to Erwin being a descendant of the Flame King, while the growth of the dark elemental was rapid due to the influence of the Dark Dragon's legacy. The growth of the light elemental was also influenced by the talent of the Chosen One after Martha's blessing, so its growth was only second to the dark elemental and fire elemental. He had been cautious in using his planeswalker abilities in the previous battle, and only used 40 earth elemental and 1 wind elemental to summon and maintain the Holy Sword and Wind Spirit Spiders. Summoning the Grimoire of Life also required him to abandon the Ocean Wave Gem and enter the battlefield for free. The Ocean Wave Gem and Eternal Orb cards were still on the battlefield, which meant that Brando's other elemental pools were still almost full. He placed 4 Nightmare Forges on the battlefield, using a total of 4 Dark Elemental. When the number of Nightmare Forges increased to 32, his Light Elemental pool instantly dropped to 0/50. The next full increase required 32 elemental pools. From 4 to 8, from 8 to 16, and from 16 to double again. The changes around Brando finally caught William's attention. The strange swarm of metal beetles seemed to have expanded in an instant. He had mistaken Brando for a summoner, so he was extremely vigilant against all of Brando's summons. But after a closer inspection, he found that the Nightmare Forges were only upper silver tier existences. He let out a sigh of relief and turned his attention to the 2 huge grimoires of life in front of Brando. The 2 grimoires of life emitted pure white light as they floated quietly in the air. At first, they seemed to have no effect, but when Brando released 4 Nightmare Forges into the battlefield, the 2 grimoires of life suddenly began to flip simultaneously. They flipped 4 pages, and with each flip, a pure energy spread out from the grimoires and pervaded the entire battlefield. It was a gentle ripple of light. It passed through all the soldiers who were allied with Brando, and the wounds on their bodies immediately healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. When the 8 ripples of light completely covered the entire battlefield, even the soldiers who were missing limbs had regrown their limbs and crawled up from the ground. In mid-air, the Shire had just used a magic shield to save Medisha from a Templar Knight. But Enrich was stabbed in the abdomen by a female Templar Knight who rushed over, almost cutting her in half. The vampire princess groaned and immediately lost consciousness and fell from mid-air. But it was at this moment that a gentle white halo passed through her body, and her wounds began to quickly heal. After 8 consecutive halos, the vampire princess actually opened her eyes again. She paused in midair and stopped her fall. More importantly, his exhausted body felt as though it had been injected with vitality after several hours of rest. A miracle. At that moment, there was only one thought in everyone's mind. Even the private soldiers of the nobles thought that there was at least one messenger of the god of life fighting side by side with them. One could imagine how much the morale of the ordinary soldiers would increase if they did not have to worry about being injured or even disabled on the battlefield. Almost immediately, the princess's army burst into cheers. The princess's morale was greatly boosted, but the morale of the Northern Coalition army, which was not high to begin with, was even lower. If it were not for the support of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the sky, the nobles' army would have retreated immediately. Williams frowned. "Stop that summoner, don't let him activate the 2 divine books," he ordered his men. It was a little awkward to say that Williams had broken through the limit of his strength and swung his sword. Although he had benefited a lot, he was a little tired at the moment. Although there was no need to worry about self-preservation, it was a little difficult to break through the defense line of the Black Tower mages and attack Brando. He could only order the remaining 11 Holy Cathedral Knights to attack Brando. Hearing this order, the Shire, Medisha, Ropar, and Enrich immediately sensed danger. The 11 Holy Cathedral Knights of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were, after all, elemental-activated powerhouses. In fact, at this time, their defense was already very weak. If the opponent wanted to bypass them and attack the Lord, they really had no way to do anything. Brando. The Shire used the almost stagnant elemental time to form a wall of delay in front of him and reminded Brando. "I know," Brando replied. He threw out another card, and a red light flashed in his hand. A flame bloomed from the forest. Infernal Djinn. Williams looked at the giant monster formed from the flames and suddenly shouted in his heart, "Oh, Martha." Brando summoned the Fire Djinn, but with the bonus of the Golden Battle Flag, it was upgraded to a higher level Infernal Djinn. This thing looked similar to the Fire Djinn, but it was bigger, and under the golden flames, there was a black infernal fire. More importantly, it could also self-destruct. As high-ranking members of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Holy Cathedral Knights were naturally not unfamiliar with the fire elemental plane. They were also familiar with the characteristics of some creatures living in that world. Therefore, when this huge flame monster appeared in their sight, everyone's face turned pale. That was a terrorist at the peak of gold. But it was obviously too late to retreat. In fact, at that moment, everyone on the battlefield felt that the sky seemed to darken slightly, but that was just an illusion caused by the pupils contracting to adapt to the strong light. They saw an extremely bright small sun rising slowly from the forest. In comparison, everything seemed to be in a state of darkness. Then, a scorching shock wave swept through the earth, and even the rain in the sky seemed to evaporate in an instant. The 11 Holy Cathedral Knights who were in the battle felt even worse. The two people who bore the brunt of the attack were seriously injured. One of them had his breastplate and shoulder armor melted in the high temperature, leaving a burn on his face. The others had no choice but to retreat, and the encirclement that was formed with great difficulty was suddenly announced. But what was even more unbearable for them was that as soon as the infernal djinn dissipated, 2 more white halos spread out from the grimoire of life. The Shire, Medisha, Ropar, and Enrich on the opposite side disappeared once again. How could they fight this? This time, Brando summoned the Furnace of Adversity. Echelonius's Furnace of Adversity was the 3rd card of the Paradise of Adversity. The cost was 30, and he specified 30 wind elements in lieu of payment. At this moment, adding the cost of summoning the Fire Djinn, Brando's Fire Elemental Pool and Wind Elemental Pool were reduced to 6378 and 2051 respectively. When Echelonius's Furnace of Adversity entered the field, it had to be attached to a volcanic land card. Brando happened to have the Ember Volcano land card. As soon as he attached the card, an industrial-style metal building immediately appeared on top of the Ember Volcano in the Planeswalker's world. The Furnace of Adversity could be said to be the engine of the Paradise of Adversity deck. Its role was to sacrifice the creatures of the Echelonius series cards to obtain a special resource dedicated to this deck, energy. However, Brando did not have any Echelonius soldiers on hand for the time being. He still needed time. Brando returned to the real world once again, and then threw out the 3rd last card from his hand. At this time, the situation on the battlefield had become white-hot. Almost all the soldiers in the valley were soldiers of the Northern Coalition Army and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Anthony's army only occupied 1 foot of the battlefield. The Nagas, the Knight Academy's officers, and the White Lion Guards stood side by side with them to block the enemy's army in front of the main position. The situation looked precarious, but with the power of the Grimoire of Life, they were still able to hold on. The young man, Eek, who was full of night thoughts, finally understood how Brando was going to help him. He could not help but shout excitedly, "Mr. Knight, I didn't expect you to be a powerful summoner." Obviously, this guy also recognized the wrong person. But Brando immediately made him even more wrong. The 3rd last card he threw out was the pitch-black Death Sentinel card of Adversity. The Death Sentinel card, the 5th card of the Paradise of Adversity, cost 15 dark elements. The characteristic of this card set was that there was no limit to the number of cards on the field. Each card would place 10 black, spirit figurines, creatures called the Death Sentinels into the field, and for every corpse on the battlefield, there would be an additional black, spirit figurines, creature called the Death Sentinel. Brando had already privately argued that if there was a place where this card could be used the most, it would be the battlefield. And now, it was the time for it to be used the most. Brando paid 15 dark elements, and the dark element pool was instantly reduced to 4,160 dark elements. But at that moment, the most spectacular scene since the beginning of the war appeared on the battlefield. At this moment, there were at least tens of thousands of corpses on the battlefield in the Marl Highlands. When the Death Sentinels entered the field, under the slippery mud and under the meadow, there was a crash sound as countless black arms broke out of the ground. Ah! Madara. Whether it was the Northern Alliance army or the soldiers on the princess side, they were all frightened and screamed in an instant. Some of them had participated in the First War of the Black Rose, and they were very familiar with Madara's ruthless fighting style. It was a nightmare to see a dead comrade appear in front of you in the next moment with a sword and attack you. But didn't the two countries sign a peace treaty? Why were these scary people here again? But at the next moment, they realized that these were not the enemies of the past. Because these warriors suddenly appeared. Their bodies were covered with tattoos, their upper bodies were naked, and their lower bodies were covered with heavy armor. As soon as they crawled out of the ground, they immediately attacked the Northern Alliance army. Allies? Princess Griffin could not help but be stunned for a moment. Then she realized something, and her silver eyes widened slightly as she looked at Brando. Mr. Brando, these are, you are a necromancer. Brando smiled bitterly. In fact, he had always put this card last because the summoning effect was too similar to a necromancer's. He shook his head. Your Royal Highness, have you seen a living necromancer? Unexpectedly, this sentence made Princess Griffin think of something that she should not think of. She blushed and touched her lips subconsciously. As everyone knew, necromancers had no body temperature. I'm sorry, I thought too much. Princess Griffin said softly. Brando immediately rolled his eyes. But it seemed that necromancers had a bad reputation in the mortal world. He should use this card less in the future. In order to avoid misunderstanding, he explained, it's actually because of them. Them. Princess Griffin and Count Audine both saw the metal beetle beside Brando. Of course, they did not know that it was a creature called the Nightmare Furnace. This thing had never appeared in the history of Vaunt. Even Brendel, who was knowledgeable and familiar with magical creatures, could not recognize it for the first time, let alone these two natives who were born and raised in Vaunt. That's right, Brendel blurted out, this thing is called the Necromancer Beetle, even though it's a type of construct. Although it is a necromancer, it can cast simple necromancer spells. It was invented by an extremely brilliant rune master. Princess Griffin and Count Audine looked at the horrible nightmare furnaces. Seeing that their ugly appearance was indeed a necromancer's style of aesthetics, and that they were indeed necromancers, they nodded together. After all, people were more willing to believe what was more in line with their common sense. Brando. You are too good at lying. Only Orthless could not help but sigh and say in his mind. Then she asked suspiciously, have you ever lied to me about anything? Absolutely not. Brando immediately shook his head. You saw it too, Lady Orthless. I had no choice. The Wind Elf nodded and reluctantly accepted this explanation. While Brando was explaining, the Northern Allied army was in big trouble. The Death Sentinels summoned by Brando were different. The level of the Death Sentinels was related to the number of black cards a planeswalker had, x5. He had 3 black cards, Rogan's Swamp, Water of the Underworld, and Forest of Death. Therefore, the Death Sentinels he summoned were already level 15, which was equivalent to the strength of a lower iron-ranked Death Knight. But under the Golden Battle flag, they became level 25 iron-ranked Death Sentinels. The range of a Death Sentinel card was about a few thousand feet, and it could summon about 1,500 black creatures. In other words, Brando had an army of 1,500 iron-ranked Death Sentinels. Coupled with the positive effect brought by the name of Madara's undead army, the situation on the battlefield suddenly changed. This time, the Northern Alliance army could not advance any further. But what surprised Brando the most was that the problem of the human soldiers fighting side by side with the Death Sentinels did not occur. Even the private soldiers of the nobles accepted their new comrade-in-arms very well. It seemed a little unreal, but after giving it some thought, he understood. He had obtained the talent of the Chosen One in the loop of trade winds, which allowed him to maintain the morale of soldiers of different races when they fought together. However, this talent did not have any practical effects, so he had almost forgotten about it all this time. But he did not expect it to be like this. The next step was simple. The sacrificed death sentinels on the battlefield were entering the furnace of adversity one by one. 2 digits of energy quickly entered Brando's storage. At the same time, the 11 Holy Cathedral Knights in the air had formed a circle and were ready to attack Medisha. But at this time, Brando looked up and raised the long sword in his hand. The Halran Gaia was pointed at a Holy Cathedral Knight in the air. A circle of black light gathered on the Halran Gaia, and the second last card was immediately displayed, Lightning Storm. Lightning Storm, Paradise of Adversity 6, for energy, spell, real-time, effect, tap all Nightmare Forges on the field, dealing 5 true damage to each of the Nightmare Forges. Enter the graveyard after use. Fire. Commander of the Echelonian Army, Turin. Everyone heard a piercing sound, and the 32 Nightmare Forges beside Brando shot out black lightning at the Holy Cathedral Knight in the air. The black lightning gathered in the air and formed a huge sharp claw. The Holy Cathedral Knight reacted quickly and immediately used the lines of law to weave a golden barrier in front of him. But unfortunately, the description of Lightning Storm deals 5 true damage to each of the Nightmare Forges immediately took effect. Everyone saw that the black lightning did not seem to have any entanglement with the golden lines in front of the Holy Cathedral Knight and directly hit his chest. It was as if he did not defend at all. This is impossible. That was the only thought in the Holy Cathedral Knight's mind. But at the same time, intense pain tore through his body. He was already heavily injured in the explosion of the Titan spirit, and this 160 true damage was the last straw that broke the camel's back. He was shot down from the air. Raphael. The female Holy Cathedral Knight cried out in alarm. She probably never dreamed that a Holy Cathedral Knight would fall in such a battle. Be careful. Williams was indeed an expert who had recently reached the Supreme Realm. His understanding of the laws was extremely sharp. He immediately identified the mystery hidden in Brando's lightning and warned his subordinates, "Don't take that lightning head-on. Be careful to avoid it." But this vice-head of the Temple Knights finally felt the danger. He had witnessed the proliferation of the Nightmare Forges with his own eyes. At first, he thought that it was just a small toy in the upper reaches of the silver tier, but he didn't expect it to have such a terrifying offensive ability. Ignoring the laws. Williams did not know why Brando had so many strange means of attack, but he did not want to see the next one. White-Winged Knight Regiment. He gritted his teeth and shouted, "Prepare to assemble." White-Winged Knight Regiment, the 5th level of the Crew's Army. Erwin's White Mane Army's Silver-Winged Knight Regiment was created to imitate these Crew's Knights. But the difference was that the Crew's White-Winged Knight Regiment was a true Pegasus Knight Regiment. And every one of them was at least a gold rank. The ones that appeared on the battlefield today were more than 100 gold rank heavy cavalry. As if responding to the orders of their regiment commander, countless silver wings flashed in the rain. The arrogant Crew's cavalry gathered together and began to assemble. The Crew's cavalry on the battlefield screamed, and the higher-ranked Pegasus Knight Regiment immediately began to leave the regiment. These heavy armored cavalry descended to a lower altitude and began to attack Brando's position. They directly crashed into the defensive line formed by the arrows of the archers, knocking those arrows into pieces. Although the Crew's empire had countless strong people, but in reality, the ones that truly shined in large-scale battles were the White-Winged Knights Regiment. And today, in Wonde, only the 4 great empires had such elite troops. The White-Winged Knight Regiment was fortunate enough to have its name listed as one of the strongest regiments. The Knight Regiment flying at the front had already raised the spear in his hand. The armor on their Pegasus shone brightly. This was the effect of the Wings of the Wind spell. Their good discipline allowed them to form a straight line as they shot towards Brando. But Brando did not even look at them. The White-Winged Knight Regiment could not help but be slightly startled. Was he scared silly? But how could a summoner with the ability to summon artifacts be scared silly by them? A crimson ponytail suddenly flashed in their vision and explained everything. The red-haired girl's eyes were burning with golden flames. She was unarmed, but she was like a female beast waiting to pounce on the charging knight regiment. She was too fast. In fact, the leading White-Winged Knight Regiment only had time to see her white fingers clenched into a fist that was getting bigger and bigger in his vision. Then, with a bang, he was sent flying off the back of his horse like a cannonball. Scarlet turned around in midair and stomped heavily on the back of his Pegasus, sending the beast flying into the forest below. Then, she used the momentum to jump up. In front of her was another knight. The unlucky guy had just seen his companion in trouble. He suspected that the other party had bumped into a dragon. He was scared out of his wits and tried to dodge, but the red-haired girl's figure had just formed two shadows in his eyes. The next moment, a cold hand had grabbed his neck. Gold Peak. How can she be so fast? He looked at the red-haired girl's eyes that were like golden whirlpools in horror. This was his last thought. Scarlet lifted him up like she was grabbing a chick and threw him out in the air. The knight collided with the third knight. Both of them fell into the valley below like a comet. After killing 3 white-winged knights in a row, Scarlet stopped and landed on the ground. She raised her head and saw that more than 100 white-winged knights had stopped in their tracks in fear of a little girl. They scattered in the air in a panic. The red-haired girl bared her small canine teeth. On her body, the scales on her arms and bare thighs were faintly flashing. She was a descendant of the dragon. A shadow rose in William's heart. At the same time, Brando cast the spell Lightning Storm. He obtained the right to draw 3 cards from his hand from the deck. Accelerated Thinking, cost 22 light or dark. Whichever player cast the spell, the holder will draw 3 cards from the top of his own deck. Before the next effect of Accelerated Thinking, the players shuffled more than 8 cards from their hand back to the deck. This was the ability of the 8th card of the Paradise of Adversity. Brando had already prepared this barrier for a long time, and this was the real reason why he asked the princess to wait for a moment. Then he drew the top of the deck. Desperate Trojan Horse, Spirit, Sun Blade. A trace of a smile appeared on Brando's face. He did not expect that the power to counterattack would return to his hands so quickly. From the Paradise of Adversity, it was just a thin line. P.S. 7,000 words long chapter. That's enough. I want to ask for monthly votes. I also want to recommend a good book. Please help me add it to your collection plus red votes. If it's not from Chidian, you can Baidu Red North's Golden Throne, please. I won't say that this is Blackie's book, Get Lost. The Empire's suffering did not only come from the fall of today, but also from the glory of the past. But one day, the Emperor's will resound in the trillions of worlds. Calling for the return of the darkness, not only for redemption, but also in response to a prophecy, the 2-headed eagle will spread its wings again, and the golden throne will be forged from iron and blood. The supreme majesty is placed on the ordinary name, and his enemies will tremble in fear, and his legend will be engraved on the epic of the conquerors. Let me tell you a secret, I was the one who helped you write the introduction. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.